The night air over the Nile River was still warm long after the sun had disappeared. A slow wind moved across the dark water, carrying the smell of wet reeds, river mud, smoke from cooking fires, and bread that had baked hours earlier in clay ovens that were now cooling beside quiet homes of mud, brick and straw. Far away, somewhere beyond the sleeping fields, a dog barked once and then became silent again. The stars above ancient Egypt looked endless. Without lamps to brighten the sky, the darkness felt deep and heavy, wrapping itself around villages, farms, temples, workshops, and narrow dirt roads that twisted between the riverbanks and the dry desert land beyond. Most people were asleep now. Workers who had carried stone beneath the heat of the day rested on woven reed mats beside their families. Farmers slept with sore backs and dusty feet. Fishermen closed their eyes beside rolled nets that still smelled of river water and fish scales. And among them, in nearly every small home beside the Nile, there were children. Some slept peacefully. Some coughed softly through the night air. Some turned restlessly beneath thin linen cloths while mosquitoes drifted near the walls. And some, even at a young age, already carried the exhaustion of adult life inside their small bodies. To be a child in ancient Egypt could sometimes feel gentle and full of warmth. There were moments of laughter beside the river. Moments of sweet dates shared between friends. Moments of swimming in cool water beneath the burning afternoon sun. But childhood in that ancient world was also fragile. Life could change quickly beneath the weight of heat, hunger, sickness, hard labor, or simple bad luck. The world around a child was not built for comfort. It was built for survival. And yet, within that difficult world, children still woke each morning beneath soft dawn light spilling through doorways of mud brick homes. They still listened to birds calling over the river reeds. They still watched bread dough rise beneath cloth coverings while their mothers ground grain with heavy stone tools. The ancient world continued around them slowly, day after day, season after season. And so tonight, as the Nile moves quietly through the darkness beneath the stars, we step gently into that forgotten world. A world where childhood was short. A world where mercy was uncertain. A world where ordinary families rose before sunrise and worked until the air finally cooled at night. And in that world, among dusty roads and crowded markets and silent temples, children learned very early what life expected from them. Long before dawn, many homes were already beginning to stir. The first sound was often movement. A mother shifting quietly across the floor. A clay jar being lifted. A wooden door creaking open. The soft scrape of sandals against packed earth. Inside most homes, there was little privacy and very little space. Entire families slept close together beneath low ceilings darkened by years of smoke from cooking fires. The walls were rough beneath the touch of the hand. The floors were hard-packed dirt, sometimes covered with woven reed mats already worn smooth from years of use. The air before sunrise felt cooler than the brutal heat that would arrive later. For a few brief moments, the world was calm. Children often woke slowly to the smell of grain being crushed into flour. Back and forth, the grinding stones moved. Heavy. Steady. Endless. Many girls learned that sound almost as early as they learned to walk. Their mothers worked the grinding stones every morning, kneeling for long periods while turning grain into flour for bread. The labor was exhausting. Fine dust from the grain filled the air and settled onto skin, hair, and clothing. Some daughters soon joined them. Small hands pressed awkwardly against the stone at first. Their arms tired quickly. Their backs ached. But over time the movement became familiar. Back and forth. Back and forth. The rhythm of survival. Outside, the eastern sky slowly softened from black to deep blue. The Nile River reflected the first thin light of morning. And as the darkness lifted, the sounds of ancient life slowly returned. Donkeys brayed from narrow alleys. Birds fluttered above palm trees. Workers called quietly to one another as they prepared for the day. Some children carried water jars from nearby wells or from the river itself before the heat became unbearable. Others gathered scraps of wood, dried reeds, or animal dung for cooking fires. The work began early because the sun showed little mercy once it rose high into the sky. Even very young children understood this. The heat shaped nearly every part of life in ancient Egypt. By midday, the air itself could feel heavy and sharp against the skin. Dust clung to sweating bodies. Sandals wore thin against rough stone streets. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads while squinting against the brightness. For children, especially those born into poor farming families, the days could feel long and endless. Many boys began helping in the fields while still very young. At sunrise they followed older workers into stretches of farmland beside the Nile. The rich black soil near the river was precious. Without the yearly flooding of the Nile, much of Egypt would have been dry and lifeless. The river gave everything: food, water, trade, life itself. And so families depended completely upon the growing seasons. Children learned quickly how deeply adults feared poor harvests. A weak flood season could bring hunger. Too much water could destroy crops. Too little water could leave fields cracked and dry beneath the burning sun. Even at a young age, children absorbed these worries from the adults around them. They heard tired conversations late at night. They watched fathers stare silently toward the riverbanks. They noticed when food portions became smaller. Most meals were simple: bread, beer made from grain, onions, beans, sometimes fish, sometimes dates or figs. Meat was rare for ordinary families. Many children grew up knowing its smell more often than its taste. Still, life moved forward quietly. Morning after morning, season after season. In farming villages beside the Nile, children often walked barefoot through damp soil while birds searched the fields beside them. The mud squeezed gently between their toes as they carried baskets or helped scatter seed. Some boys guided animals through fields while older workers pushed wooden plows through the earth. Others frightened birds away from crops by shouting and waving their arms beneath the hot sky. The labor never truly stopped. And childhood drifted quietly beside it. There were moments of play, of course. Children laughed beside the river. They made toys from reeds, clay, scraps of wood, and bits of cloth. Some rolled hoops through dusty streets. Some played games with stones tossed across the ground. Some floated in shallow water along the riverbanks while trying to escape the heat. But even these moments often existed beside responsibility. A child could be laughing one moment and carrying heavy water jars the next. Life demanded usefulness from everyone, especially the poor. As the sun climbed higher, the villages became brighter and harsher beneath the heat. The white stone walls of temples reflected the sunlight so intensely that people narrowed their eyes while passing. In crowded workshops, the air grew thick with sweat, dust, smoke, and the sharp smell of metal or dye. Some children worked in these places too. Apprenticeship often began young. A boy whose father shaped pottery might spend his childhood surrounded by spinning clay wheels and drying pots stacked carefully beneath the sun. Another child might carry tools for a carpenter or sweep stone dust from a mason's workshop. The sounds were constant: hammering, scraping, sawing, voices calling through narrow streets. Animals shifting restlessly in the heat. And everywhere, the smell of human labor. Warm skin. Dust. Smoke. Mud. River water. Bread baking beneath clay ovens. For wealthy children, life looked different, though not always easier. The homes of richer families were larger and cooler. Some had painted walls, gardens, servants, and pools of water that reflected sunlight into shaded courtyards. Children of scribes, priests, or officials sometimes learned reading and writing. This was rare. Most people in ancient Egypt could not read. But for a small number of boys born into privileged families, education opened the door to a different future. Their mornings might begin not in the fields but in schoolrooms beside temples or government buildings. There, beneath shaded roofs, they copied symbols carefully onto pieces of limestone, wooden tablets, or papyrus. The Egyptian writing system was difficult and demanded patience. Teachers could be strict. Very strict. Ancient writings describe beatings used as punishment for lazy students or poor work. One old saying warned that a boy's ears were on his back because he listened when he was beaten. The ancient world often believed hardship created discipline. Mercy was not always considered useful. And so even privileged childhood carried fear. Many boys spent long hours memorizing signs and practicing careful brush strokes while sweat rolled down their backs in the afternoon heat. Still, becoming a scribe offered one of the few paths away from brutal physical labor. Scribes worked with words instead of stone blocks. They sat instead of carrying. They recorded taxes, shipments, letters, harvests, and laws. For poor families, the idea of a child becoming a scribe could seem almost impossible and deeply precious at the same time. But most children would never hold a writing brush. Most would spend their lives close to the earth. Close to the river. Close to labor. As afternoon slowly faded toward evening, the light over Egypt softened into gold. The worst heat finally began to loosen its grip. Workers returned from fields and workshops covered in dust and sweat. Children walked beside them carrying baskets, tools, fishing nets, or bundles of reeds. The Nile glowed quietly beneath the lowering sun. Birds crossed the sky in slow dark shapes. And for a short while, the world seemed softer. Women prepared the evening meal while smoke drifted upward into the warm air. Bread baked once again. Fish crackled over fires. Clay jars were filled with water carried from the river earlier in the day. Children often sat nearby, exhausted from work and heat. Some leaned against walls while fighting sleep. Others listened silently to adults speaking about crops, taxes, repairs, or sickness spreading through nearby villages. Illness was always near in ancient Egypt. The river that gave life could also carry disease. Insects spread sickness through the wetlands. Cuts became infected. Fevers arrived suddenly. Children were especially vulnerable. Many families buried sons and daughters long before adulthood. Parents understood this painful uncertainty deeply. Love and grief often existed side by side. Some mothers tied protective amulets around their children's necks. Some prayed quietly to household gods for safety. Some whispered hopes into the darkness while sitting beside sleeping children at night. The ancient Egyptians believed strongly in protection, magic, and the unseen world. Charms hung inside homes. Small statues stood in corners. Spoken prayers drifted softly through candlelit rooms. Because life itself often felt fragile. Especially for the young. As darkness returned once more to the Nile Valley, the noise of the day slowly faded. The markets became quiet. The workshops emptied. The roads darkened. Families gathered inside their homes beneath flickering oil lamps. Children curled onto reed mats beside parents, brothers, sisters, and grandparents. The rooms remained warm through much of the night. Sometimes unbearably warm. Outside, the desert wind moved softly across the sleeping land. Somewhere in the darkness, water touched gently against the riverbank. And another day in ancient Egypt came to its quiet end. But for many children, tomorrow would arrive quickly. Before sunrise, the grinding stones would begin again. The fields would wait. The workshops would open. The labor would continue beneath the endless movement of the sun and river. And childhood, brief and delicate, would keep unfolding quietly within that ancient world without mercy. Before the first light reached the tops of the palm trees, the villages beside the Nile were already breathing awake again. The darkness before dawn carried its own sounds. A donkey shifting against a wooden post. The distant splash of water along the riverbank. Quiet footsteps moving through narrow alleys between mud brick homes. And somewhere, almost always, the low steady grinding of grain beneath heavy stone tools. The sound drifted through the sleeping streets like a slow heartbeat. Children often woke to it long before they were fully rested. The nights in ancient Egypt were not always peaceful. Heat lingered inside homes long after sunset, especially during the hotter months when the air itself seemed unable to cool. Families slept close together on mats woven from reeds, sometimes beneath thin linen cloths dampened with sweat. Mosquitoes hummed in the darkness. Babies cried softly. People coughed through dry throats irritated by dust and smoke from cooking fires. And then, before the stars had fully disappeared, another day quietly began. For many children, mornings started with water. Water for drinking. Water for cooking. Water for washing dust from skin and hands. The Nile was everything, and nearly every family depended on it from sunrise until nightfall. Young girls often carried clay jars balanced carefully against their hips or shoulders as they walked toward the riverbanks in the pale morning light. The jars were heavy even when empty. Full of water, they became far more difficult. The paths near the river were already busy. Women spoke softly while waiting their turn. Fishermen untangled nets beside narrow boats. Boys chased goats away from baskets of food. The smell of wet mud rose from the riverbanks where reeds bent gently beside the moving water. Sometimes children paused there for a moment before returning home. The Nile at dawn could feel strangely calm. Mist floated low over the surface. Birds stood motionless in the shallows. The first sunlight slowly touched the water with pale gold. For a brief time before the heat arrived, the world seemed quiet and cool. But the calm never lasted long. Once the sun climbed higher, labor returned to every corner of life. Children of farming families learned early how closely the body could become tied to exhaustion. Their muscles hardened young. Their feet toughened against dirt paths and stone floors. Their skin darkened beneath years of sunlight. Some children helped care for younger brothers and sisters almost constantly. In crowded homes, older daughters especially carried enormous responsibility. A girl only 10 or 11 years old might already spend much of her day carrying infants, preparing food, cleaning tools, gathering fuel for fires, and assisting her mother in nearly every task. Childhood moved quickly for her. The ancient world rarely paused to protect innocence. Life expected participation. Even small hands were needed. Inside many homes, mornings smelled of bread dough, smoke, damp clay, and sweat already forming beneath the growing heat. Mothers mixed grain flour with water while shaping rough loaves by hand. Some homes owned small ovens. Others baked over open fires or used shared ovens within the village. Children watched carefully because these routines would someday belong to them. A daughter learned by observing her mother. A son learned by following his father. Knowledge passed slowly through repetition. There were few written instructions for ordinary people. The body itself became memory. Hands remembered what the mind no longer needed to think about. How to shape clay. How to repair fishing nets. How to guide animals through flooded fields. How to carry heavy baskets without losing balance. How to survive another season beside the river. As the villages brightened beneath the morning sun, more people filled the dusty roads. Merchants opened stalls covered with woven mats for shade. Potters arranged jars and bowls outside workshops. Bakers carried fresh loaves through crowded streets while flies gathered around the warm bread. Children moved through this world constantly. Some ran errands between homes and markets. Some followed adults silently while carrying bundles of goods. Some worked directly beside skilled laborers, learning trades that would likely shape the rest of their lives. The workshops of ancient Egypt were places of endless movement. In metal shops, the air grew hot almost immediately after sunrise. Fires roared beneath furnaces while workers hammered copper or bronze into tools, blades, bowls, jewelry, and household objects. The noise echoed against stone walls. Hammer against metal. Hammer against metal. Again and again. Young apprentices swept floors blackened by ash and soot. They carried charcoal, fetched water, and watched older craftsmen shape glowing metal beneath clouds of heat. In woodworking shops, boys carried planks while sawdust clung to sweaty skin. The smell of cut wood mixed with smoke drifting through the open streets outside. In textile workshops, girls and women spun thread from flax fibers. Fingers moved constantly through the long slow work while dust floated in narrow beams of sunlight entering through small windows. Many children spent entire days inside these crowded spaces. The labor could be repetitive and tiring, yet it also connected families together. Trades often passed through generations. A son of a fisherman usually became a fisherman. A daughter raised in weaving rooms often became a weaver herself. The future arrived early in ancient Egypt. There was little time for wandering between possibilities. Life followed the river, the seasons, and the work already waiting. Yet even in difficult conditions, children still found moments of softness hidden quietly between responsibilities. Sometimes boys climbed date palms while laughing together high above the ground despite warnings shouted from below. Sometimes girls sang softly while grinding grain or carrying water jars through the village. Children chased one another through dusty streets beneath fading evening light. They floated on small reed rafts near the riverbanks. They tossed carved stones during games played in shaded corners beside homes and workshops. These moments mattered deeply because they were brief. The ancient world could become harsh without warning. An injury during work might never fully heal. A poor harvest could bring hunger to an entire village. Disease moved silently through crowded homes. And children understood death much earlier than many people do today. Funeral processions were not rare sights. The Egyptians believed deeply in the journey after death. Tombs, prayers, offerings, and burial rituals shaped much of their culture. Even poor families tried to honor the dead as best they could, though their graves were simple compared to the massive tombs built for kings and nobles. Children sometimes watched quietly as bodies wrapped in linen were carried beyond the edges of villages toward burial places near the desert. The dry sands waited silently beneath the burning sky. For many families, grief became part of ordinary life. A mother might continue preparing bread while mourning a lost child. A father still entered the fields despite carrying sadness heavily inside him. Labor left little room for stopping. The Nile continued flowing. The crops still needed water. The animals still needed care. And so life moved onward even when hearts were tired. During flood season, the entire rhythm of Egypt changed. Each year the Nile rose slowly, spilling rich dark water across the farmland beside its banks. The flooding was both feared and welcomed. Without it, the soil would lose its strength. Children watched the waters carefully. Some helped move animals and supplies to safer ground. Others traveled with adults through partially flooded paths using small boats that glided silently over waters covering the fields. The smell during flood season was different. Wet earth, river plants, mud warming beneath sunlight. The entire land seemed to breathe differently. When the waters finally retreated, they left behind thick fertile soil ready for planting. Farmers returned to the fields quickly because the growing season allowed little delay. Children returned with them. The cycle began again. Planting, watering, harvesting, grinding grain, baking bread. Endless repetition beneath the movement of the sun. In larger cities, life could feel even more crowded and exhausting. Places like ancient Memphis or Thebes overflowed with workers, merchants, servants, priests, officials, and laborers from sunrise until deep into the night. Dust drifted constantly through the air. Animals pushed through crowded roads. Temple walls towered above narrow streets lined with homes, workshops, and market stalls. Children growing up there learned quickly how noisy the world could become. The cries of merchants mixed with hammering tools and shouting workers. The smell of cooking fires blended with sweat, animal waste, incense from temples, and mud carried from the river. Servant children inside wealthy households often lived especially difficult lives. Some were born into servitude. Others entered wealthy homes because their families needed food or protection. These children cleaned floors, carried water, washed clothing, prepared food, and obeyed endless instructions from adults above them in status. Many slept on simple mats near kitchens, storage rooms, or servant quarters where the air remained hot and crowded. Yet even within these difficult lives, small moments of comfort still appeared. A servant child might pause for a moment beside a shaded courtyard pool and feel cool air rising from the water. A kitchen worker might secretly taste honey while preparing food for a wealthy family. A tired child might sit beneath evening stars after finishing chores and listen quietly to music drifting from a distant celebration somewhere deeper within the city. The ancient world was rarely completely without beauty. It simply asked a great deal from the people living inside it, especially the young. As afternoon heat settled heavily over the land once more, workers often slowed their pace slightly. Some rested briefly in narrow strips of shade beside walls or beneath woven coverings stretched above market stalls. Children rested where they could. A boy sleeping beside fishing baskets. A girl leaning against warm stone while holding her baby brother. An apprentice closing tired eyes for only a few moments before work resumed again. The heat pressed down on everyone equally. Rich or poor. Farmer or scribe. Child or adult. By evening, when the sunlight softened and shadows stretched longer across the ground, relief slowly returned. Families gathered near homes. Cooking fires flickered. Voices became quieter. Some children listened to stories told by grandparents who remembered earlier flood seasons, earlier kings, earlier years when harvests had been stronger or harder. Stories passed gently through generations beneath the night sky. Tales of gods traveling through the heavens. Stories about the Nile itself. Stories about spirits, animals, kings, and journeys beyond death. Children listened while sleep slowly pulled at them. Oil lamps flickered against mud brick walls. Outside, warm winds moved softly through the palm trees. And beyond the villages, beyond the temples and roads and sleeping farms, the desert remained silent beneath the endless stars. There, in the darkness surrounding the fertile river valley, ancient Egypt felt small and fragile. A thin ribbon of life surrounded by endless dry emptiness. And within that narrow world, children continued growing quietly beneath the weight of labor, heat, love, fear, hunger, routine, and time itself. Another dawn would arrive soon enough. The grinding stones would begin again. The river would continue moving north through the sleeping land. And countless children would wake once more to the ancient rhythm of survival beside the Nile. In the deepest hours of the night, when most of the village had finally fallen silent, the Nile still moved steadily through the darkness. The river never truly rested. Moonlight touched the slow water in silver lines that shifted gently beside the reeds. Small insects drifted above the surface. Somewhere far away, an oar dipped softly into the river with slow and careful movement as fishermen traveled beneath the stars. Inside the homes along the riverbanks, families slept close together. The air remained warm even after midnight. Children turned quietly in their sleep while the smell of dust, clay, smoke, and dried reeds lingered inside the rooms. Some dreamed peacefully. Others coughed through sickness or stirred from hunger that had never fully disappeared after the evening meal. Night in ancient Egypt could feel strangely gentle and difficult at the same time. For many children, sleep itself was not always easy. The mats beneath them were thin. The rooms were crowded. Dogs barked outside. Insects hummed endlessly in the darkness. And sometimes fear lived quietly inside the mind. Fear of illness. Fear of harsh punishment. Fear of the uncertain future waiting ahead. Children learned early that adults themselves often carried heavy worries. A father might sit silently near the doorway long after everyone else had fallen asleep, staring toward the darkness outside while thinking about taxes owed after harvest season. A mother might quietly touch the forehead of a feverish child again and again through the night while whispering prayers beneath her breath. The ancient world could feel fragile after sunset. Without sunlight, everything became quieter and less certain. Oil lamps flickered against mud brick walls, casting soft moving shadows across sleeping faces. Beyond the villages, the desert waited in complete silence. And slowly, almost without notice, the first cool moments before dawn would begin again. These brief hours before sunrise were often the most peaceful part of the day. The air softened. The heat loosened. For a short while, children stepping outside their homes could feel cool earth beneath their feet instead of burning dust and stone. Some families rose very early simply to work before the worst heat arrived. In farming villages, boys followed fathers and older brothers toward the fields while darkness still covered the sky. The stars slowly faded above them. Sandals brushed softly against dirt paths. Donkeys carried baskets or tools while breathing heavily in the still air. The Nile nearby reflected the pale blue light of approaching morning. For young children, the walk itself could feel endless. Sleep still pulled heavily at their eyes while they carried tools almost as long as their arms. Yet few adults asked whether children felt ready for the work ahead. Readiness mattered less than necessity. If a family needed help in the fields, then help was expected. Some boys spent long mornings standing ankle-deep in muddy water while guiding animals or clearing irrigation channels blocked with thick wet soil. The mud clung heavily to their legs beneath the rising heat. Mosquitoes gathered near the water. The smell of river earth mixed with sweat as the sun climbed higher. Other children worked farther from the river where dry winds carried sand across the fields. There, under the open sky, the heat arrived quickly and stayed for hours. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads. Children squinted against the brightness. The sound of insects filled the air while wooden tools scraped against the earth in slow, steady rhythms. In many ways, the body became the center of childhood in ancient Egypt. The body worked. The body endured heat. The body carried weight. The body became tired. And because medical knowledge was limited, injuries and sickness often stayed much longer than anyone hoped. A cut on the foot could grow dangerous. A fever might quietly worsen over several days. An infected tooth could bring terrible pain without relief. Children watched adults continue working through exhaustion and illness because survival left little room for stopping. Many learned to hide discomfort early. Complaints did not always change anything. The work still remained. Yet tenderness existed too, often in small quiet ways. A mother adjusting cloth over a sleeping child. A father carrying a tired son home after a long day near the river. An older sister brushing dust gently from her younger brother's face before bed. Love in ancient Egypt was rarely soft in the way modern people sometimes imagine childhood should be. But it was still there. Hidden inside routine. Hidden inside sacrifice. Hidden inside exhaustion. During harvest season, villages became busier than ever. The fields filled with workers from sunrise until evening as families hurried to gather grain before it spoiled beneath heat or weather. Sickles flashed beneath the sun while stalks of grain fell into thick bundles tied by rough, tired hands. Children joined the work immediately. Some gathered dropped grain from the ground behind adult workers. Others carried bundles much larger than their own bodies. Dust rose into the air constantly while sweat rolled down faces and soaked through linen clothing. The smell of dry grain covered everything. Sharp. Warm. Earthy. By midday the heat became crushing. Workers rested briefly when possible beneath small shaded coverings or beside walls casting narrow strips of darkness across the ground. Children often fell asleep almost instantly during these moments, curled against baskets or grain sacks while flies drifted lazily around them. But rest never lasted long. The harvest had to be finished. The grain stored safely. The taxes measured. Ancient Egyptian officials carefully recorded harvest amounts because much of the grain belonged not only to farming families but also to temples, nobles, and the state itself. Scribes appeared in villages carrying writing pallets and rolls of papyrus. They counted harvests, recorded payments, and monitored supplies. To poor children watching from nearby fields, scribes must have seemed strange in some ways. Their hands were softer. Their work cleaner. They sat beneath shade while others bent beneath the sun. And yet even scribes had often once been children shaped by strict discipline and fear. Education itself could feel harsh. Boys training as scribes copied symbols endlessly while teachers corrected mistakes sharply. Some schools used physical punishment regularly. Ancient writings speak openly about beatings, treating them as ordinary parts of learning. The world believed obedience protected order. And order mattered deeply in Egypt. The kingdom depended upon stability. The river followed its cycle. The stars followed theirs. The people were expected to do the same. Children learned this quietly from the adults surrounding them every day. Know your place. Do your work. Endure hardship. Continue forward. For girls, the future often arrived even sooner. Many young girls spent nearly all their time preparing for adult responsibilities long before reaching adulthood itself. They watched mothers prepare meals, weave cloth, clean homes, care for children, and manage the endless small duties that kept families alive. Some girls married very young by modern standards. Childhood blurred gradually into womanhood without clear separation. A girl might still play beside the river one year and carry her own infant the next. Life moved quickly beneath the ancient sun. And because survival depended heavily on family labor, every new responsibility arrived early. In wealthier households, daughters sometimes lived more sheltered lives within larger homes surrounded by servants and shaded courtyards. Yet even there, expectations remained strong. Noble families cared deeply about marriage arrangements, household management, reputation, and obedience. Freedom itself was limited for nearly everyone in the ancient world. Especially for children. As afternoon faded toward evening, the sounds of labor slowly changed across the Nile Valley. The sharp noise of tools softened. Animals returned toward villages. Boats drifted slowly along the river carrying fish, grain, pottery, reeds, and stone between towns. Children walked home exhausted beneath skies turning gold and orange. Dust covered their legs. Their hands smelled of mud, grain, fish, or smoke. Many carried younger siblings on tired hips while following narrow paths between fields. The evenings often brought the closest thing to peace many families experienced all day. The heat eased slightly. Shadows stretched longer across walls and roads. Cooking fires glowed softly outside homes while bread baked once more for the night meal. Inside crowded kitchens, children helped prepare food using motions already deeply familiar despite their age. Grinding grain. Mixing dough. Cleaning fish. Cutting onions. Fanning fires. The smells of evening drifted through entire villages. Warm bread. Smoke. River fish. Lentils cooking slowly in clay pots. Sometimes richer scents floated from wealthier homes nearby where roasted meat or sweet cakes were prepared for special occasions. Poor children noticed those smells immediately. Food shaped daily life powerfully in ancient Egypt because hunger was never very far away. Even during stable years, many families lived close to scarcity. Failed harvests, flooding problems, pests, illness, or heavy taxation could quickly create suffering. Children often understood the mood of a household simply by watching food. How much bread remained. Whether beer was watered down. Whether adults quietly skipped portions during meals. Parents frequently sacrificed their own comfort first. A tired mother might claim she was no longer hungry while passing the last piece of bread toward her children instead. These quiet acts rarely appeared in official records carved onto temple walls. The monuments of kings did not speak about them. But they happened endlessly inside ordinary homes across the Nile Valley. After the evening meal, darkness slowly returned once more. The stars emerged above Egypt with remarkable clarity. Children sitting outside homes beside cooling fires could look upward and see countless points of light stretching endlessly across the sky. The ancient Egyptians studied those stars carefully. Priests tracked celestial movements. Farmers watched seasonal changes. Sailors traveled by familiar patterns in the night sky. To children, the stars likely felt both beautiful and mysterious. The heavens above the Nile seemed enormous. Silent. Eternal. And beneath them, ordinary life continued quietly. Some nights brought music drifting through villages during festivals or celebrations. Drums echoed softly through warm air while dancers moved beside torchlight. Children stayed awake longer during these evenings, watching adults sing, clap, and drink beer beneath the stars. For a little while, exhaustion loosened its hold. Laughter returned. Neighbors gathered together. The hard routines of labor softened briefly into celebration. But eventually the music faded. The fires dimmed. Families returned indoors. and once again children curled onto woven mats inside warm dark rooms while tomorrow waited only a few hours away. Outside, the Nile kept moving steadily through the sleeping land. Water touched gently against boats tied along the shore. Palm leaves rustled softly in the night wind. And across ancient Egypt, countless children drifted into uneasy sleep while another difficult dawn slowly approached beyond the eastern horizon. Before sunrise, the world beside the Nile often felt suspended between sleep and waking. The villages were dark except for a few dim oil lamps glowing faintly through open doorways. Smoke from early cooking fires drifted slowly upward into the cool air. The smell of damp earth still lingered from the riverbanks where the night mist had settled over reeds and mud. Children stirred quietly beneath linen coverings while adults were already beginning another day. Some woke immediately when called. Others struggled to open heavy eyes after too little sleep. A mother might touch a child's shoulder gently at first, then more firmly a moment later when there was still no movement. Outside, somewhere nearby, grain was already being ground into flour with the familiar steady scrape of stone against stone. Back and forth. Back and forth. The sound belonged to morning itself. In many homes, children ate very little before work began. A piece of bread. A few dates if the family could spare them. Water or weak beer mixed carefully to make supplies last longer through the day. Then the labor started again beneath the slowly brightening sky. Along the Nile, fishermen prepared their boats while the stars still faded overhead. Some boys joined them from an early age. Fishing families depended on the river completely, and children learned quickly how dangerous and unpredictable the water could become. Small reed boats rocked gently against the shore while nets lay piled nearby smelling of algae, fish scales, and wet rope. The river looked peaceful at dawn. Almost soft. But beneath the quiet surface lived crocodiles, deep currents, hidden mud, and constant uncertainty. Young boys helped push boats into the water with sleepy arms still weak from childhood. Their feet slipped in wet mud near the shore while older fishermen checked nets carefully before leaving. Then slowly the boats drifted outward into pale morning light. The Nile during those early hours could feel strangely endless. Mist hovered low above the water. Birds skimmed the surface searching for fish. The sound of oars dipping gently into the river echoed quietly across the stillness. Children sitting inside those small boats often learned silence early. Fishing required patience. Long stretches passed with little conversation while the sun climbed higher and the heat slowly returned. Sometimes the catch was good. Sometimes it was not. And when it was poor, entire households felt the weight of disappointment by evening. Back in the villages, other children moved toward workshops already growing warm with activity. Pottery workshops smelled of wet clay and smoke. Boys carried water buckets while potters shaped spinning clay beneath skilled fingers coated in mud. Rows of unfinished jars dried beneath the rising sun while flies drifted lazily through the heavy air. The younger children watched carefully. Everything was instruction. How to shape the clay evenly. How much water to use. How long pots needed to dry before firing. Mistakes cost valuable materials, and poor families could not easily afford waste. In weaving rooms, girls sat beside mothers and older sisters while fingers worked endlessly through strands of flax. The work demanded patience and long hours. Tiny fibers floated constantly through beams of sunlight entering from small windows high in the walls. The rooms became hotter as the day continued. Sweat gathered along necks and backs. Hands cramped from repetition. Still the work continued because cloth was needed everywhere. For clothing. For trade. For burial wrappings. For household life itself. Children learned quickly that nearly every object surrounding them existed because someone's body had labored to create it. Bread came from grinding and baking. Clothing came from spinning and weaving. Boats came from cutting and shaping wood. Homes came from mud carried basket by basket beneath the heat. Nothing appeared easily. Everything required effort. Even rest had to be earned. As the sun climbed higher over Egypt, light filled the villages completely. White stone temples reflected brightness so intensely that people shielded their eyes while passing. Donkeys crowded narrow streets carrying grain sacks or pottery jars. Merchants called softly from shaded stalls while children moved between them carrying baskets, messages, or water. The smells of daytime grew stronger. Animal dung drying beneath the heat. Fish laid out for sale. Warm bread cooling on woven mats. Smoke rising from ovens. Sweat covering workers standing beneath the sun. The ancient world was deeply physical. Children experienced it through touch, smell, heat, exhaustion, and sound long before they could fully understand larger ideas about power, religion, or kingship. A child knew the roughness of rope against small hands. The weight of water jars. The sting of dust entering tired eyes. The ache in the legs after standing for hours. These were the lessons of ordinary life. And yet there were moments when childhood itself still appeared quietly beneath the labor. A group of boys splashing one another near the riverbank after work. Girls laughing softly while balancing jars atop their heads. Children chasing stray dogs through dusty streets while adults shouted for them to slow down. The joy was often brief but real. It survived inside difficult lives because children naturally searched for lightness even in hard places. Sometimes they found it in games. Sometimes in songs. Sometimes simply in friendship beside the river at sunset. But danger remained close. Many children worked around tools, fires, animals, and water from very young ages. Injuries happened often. A slip beside an oven could burn skin badly. A fall from a date palm could break bones. A fishing accident might pull someone beneath the river current before help arrived. Medical treatment existed, but it was limited. Ancient Egyptian healers understood some practical remedies using herbs, oils, bandages, and simple surgeries. They could treat wounds, set broken bones, and prepare medicines from plants gathered along the Nile. But many illnesses remained mysterious and frightening. Fever especially terrified families. A healthy child could weaken quickly beneath sickness during the hot months. Parents watched helplessly as bodies became hotter and breathing more difficult. Inside crowded homes, illness spread easily. Children slept close together. Shared food. Shared water. Shared air thick with smoke and dust. Some recovered slowly. Some did not. And because death was so familiar in the ancient world, grief often settled quietly into daily life without stopping it completely. A mother might still rise before dawn after losing a child only days earlier. The grain still needed grinding. The younger children still needed feeding. The animals still needed water. Sorrow moved beside routine rather than replacing it. This was one of the hardest truths of ancient life. The world rarely paused long enough for mourning. By midday the heat became almost unbearable across much of Egypt. Even the animals searched desperately for shade. Children working outdoors wrapped cloth around their heads while squinting against the blinding sunlight reflecting from sand and stone. Sweat dried almost immediately in the hot wind, leaving skin coated with dust and salt. Some workers rested briefly during the hottest hours. Others could not. Construction laborers continued hauling stone blocks. Boat workers unloaded heavy cargo along river docks. Servants moved constantly through wealthy homes carrying water, food, linens, and messages. Many servant children spent entire days barefoot on burning stone floors. Inside rich households, life followed a different rhythm than in poor farming villages, yet children there also faced strict expectations. Sons of officials studied reading, writing, mathematics, and religious instruction for long hours beneath the watchful eyes of tutors. Mistakes brought punishment. Discipline mattered deeply. A wealthy child's future carried enormous pressure because family status depended on proper behavior and successful advancement within the kingdom's bureaucracy. Daughters in noble households learned household management, music, religion, and social customs expected of elite women. Servants often surrounded them, yet their lives were still carefully controlled by family authority. Freedom belonged to very few people in ancient Egypt. Almost everyone answered to someone above them. And children, perhaps more than anyone else, understood this clearly. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening, the villages began changing once again. The light turned warmer. Long shadows stretched across roads and courtyards. Workers returned from fields carrying tools over tired shoulders while children followed behind with slower, exhausted steps. Near the riverbanks, fishermen cleaned their catch while birds circled overhead waiting for scraps. The smell of fish mixed with wet reeds and mud warming beneath the last sunlight of the day. Women prepared evening meals while younger children sat nearby fighting sleep. The sounds of cooking spread through the village. Crackling fires. Clay lids shifting against pots. Grinding stones still moving through one final round of flour preparation before night. Inside homes, conversations remained simple and practical. How much grain remained? Whether the irrigation channels needed repair. Who was sick? Which animals had wandered too far? Whether taxes would increase after harvest season. Children listened quietly to these discussions while eating slowly beside flickering lamplight. They learned early that adult life was full of concern. Yet they also learned endurance from watching their parents continue forward despite exhaustion. After the meal, darkness gathered gently over the Nile Valley once more. The air cooled slightly. Families stepped outside their homes for a little while before sleep. Some sat quietly beneath the stars. Others repaired tools or mended nets in the fading light. Children rested against parents or older siblings while listening to distant sounds drifting through the night. Music from a celebration somewhere far away. Dogs barking near the edge of the village. Water touching softly against the shore. The stars above ancient Egypt seemed impossibly bright. Without modern lights, the heavens stretched clearly from horizon to horizon. Children lying beside their families could stare upward for long periods while the warm night wind moved gently through the palm trees. Perhaps some wondered what their futures would become. Perhaps most were simply too tired to wonder very much at all. Sleep arrived quickly after days filled with labor. One by one, the lamps dimmed inside the homes. The roads became empty. The workshops silent. And once again the Nile flowed quietly through the darkness beside a sleeping world where childhood remained brief, fragile, and deeply tied to the endless rhythm of survival. Far out beyond the villages and green riverbanks, the desert waited in silence beneath the fading stars. The sand held the memory of the day's heat long into the night. Dry winds moved slowly across empty stone and dunes where almost nothing grew. From a distance, the fertile land beside the Nile must have seemed like a narrow ribbon of life surrounded by endless stillness. And every morning, as the first light spread across the horizon, children woke once again within that thin living world between river and desert. The dawn came softly at first. A pale silver glow touched the tops of date palms. Birds stirred inside the reeds. The Nile reflected the changing sky with quiet movement. Then slowly, house by house, the villages awakened. A door opened. Sandals scraped against packed earth. Someone coughed in the darkness. A clay jar was lifted carefully from the floor. Children often woke already tired. Their bodies carried the heaviness of constant labor, especially during the hotter seasons when work stretched long beneath the burning sun. Yet very few mornings allowed extra rest. Time mattered too much. Water needed carrying. Animals needed feeding. Fields needed tending before the heat became too severe. Inside the homes, mothers were already preparing the day's first bread. The smell of flour and smoke drifted gently through the warm air while grinding stones moved in their slow familiar rhythm. Back and forth. Back and forth. The sound seemed endless across ancient Egypt. Girls learned those motions early. Many began helping almost as soon as they were strong enough to push the heavy stones properly. At first the work felt awkward and exhausting. Their small shoulders ached quickly. Their hands blistered. But over time their bodies adapted. The ancient world shaped children through repetition. A task done every day eventually became part of the body itself. Outside, the villages gradually filled with movement. Men carried farming tools toward the fields. Donkeys hauled baskets through narrow roads. Merchants arranged goods beneath woven shade coverings while dust slowly rose beneath countless footsteps. Children moved through it all quietly, already part of the working world around them. Some boys traveled with older brothers toward irrigation canals where water from the Nile flowed carefully through channels feeding the farmland. Maintaining those canals required constant labor. Mud collapsed into the water. Weeds blocked narrow passages. Flood damage needed repair after every season. The work was messy and tiring. Children stood knee-deep in wet earth while scooping mud beneath the growing heat. Mosquitoes hovered around the water. Their feet slipped constantly in the thick river soil. Yet there could also be peaceful moments there. The sound of flowing water. The sight of birds lifting slowly into the morning sky. The coolness of mud before the full heat of noon arrived. Sometimes children paused briefly just to feel that coolness against their skin before work resumed again. In larger farming areas, the fields stretched outward in wide green patches beside the river. Wheat and barley moved softly in the wind while workers bent low beneath the sunlight. Children frightened birds away from crops by waving cloth or shouting across the fields. Others gathered bundles of cut plants into baskets carried back toward storage areas. The smell of growing grain mixed with wet soil and sweat. Everything beneath the Egyptian sun seemed to carry a scent. Warm stone. River water. Animals. Smoke. Dust. Human labor itself. For children, these smells became the background of life. And because most families remained close together through work and home life, children spent nearly every hour surrounded by adults. There was little separation between the worlds of children and grown people. Young eyes saw everything. Arguments between tired parents. The strain of hunger during difficult seasons. The air over the Nile came with illness when the first sounds of quiet tenderness of exhausted mothers rocking babies late at night. The ancient world revealed itself fully to children from an early age. There was no illusion that life would always be gentle. Still, there were traditions and comforts that gave rhythm to daily existence. Festivals sometimes arrived with music, dancing, food, and offerings to the gods. During these moments, even poor families tried to celebrate. Children stayed awake later than usual while drums echoed through villages and torchlight flickered against temple walls. The temples themselves fascinated many children. Their enormous stone columns rose high above the surrounding towns. Painted walls showed gods, kings, animals, boats, stars, and scenes from sacred stories. Priests moved through cool shadowed halls carrying incense while chants echoed softly inside the stone chambers. For ordinary children, temples could feel mysterious and distant at the same time. They represented power, order, protection, and the presence of forces greater than human life. The Egyptians believed deeply that the world depended on balance. The flooding Nile, the movement of the sun, the turning stars above the desert, all of it belonged to a sacred order that had to be maintained. Children absorbed these beliefs naturally from the adults around them. Prayers before meals. Offerings left at shrines. Protective charms hanging near doorways. Stories told beneath the stars about gods traveling through the heavens each night. Even in poor homes with little food and few possessions, faith remained close. A mother might whisper prayers quietly over a sick child while placing a small amulet beside the sleeping mat. A father might leave offerings near a local shrine before beginning an important season of work. Life felt uncertain enough that many people searched constantly for protection from unseen dangers. And there were many dangers indeed. One of the greatest was hunger. When harvests failed or taxes became too heavy, entire communities suffered quickly. Grain stores emptied. Bread portions became smaller. Weakness spread slowly through homes already strained by labor and heat. Children suffered most easily during these times. Their bodies were smaller, more vulnerable. Some became thin and sick from lack of food while still expected to work beside adults each day. Yet even during hardship, people continued caring for one another as best they could. Neighbors shared supplies when possible. Families gathered together more closely. Older siblings carried younger children when exhaustion became too much. Survival depended heavily on cooperation. No one endured the Nile Valley entirely alone. As afternoon approached, the sunlight over Egypt became harsh and white again. The roads shimmered beneath the heat. Workers wrapped cloth tightly around their heads while seeking moments of shade wherever they could find it. Children often became quieter during these hours. The heat drained energy from the body slowly and completely. A boy carrying water jars might pause beside a wall simply to breathe for a moment. A young girl weaving flax beside her mother might lower her head briefly as sleep tugged at her eyes. Even the animals moved more slowly. Dogs rested beneath carts. Donkeys stood silently in narrow strips of shadow. Birds disappeared into the reeds near the river. Inside wealthy homes, servants moved carefully through cooler shaded rooms built around open courtyards. Water pools reflected sunlight gently against painted walls while rich families escaped some of the harshness outside. But even here, servant children worked constantly. Sweeping floors. Preparing baths. Carrying trays of food. Cleaning linens. The contrast between wealth and poverty was visible everywhere in ancient Egypt. Some children wore fine linen and learned writing. Others owned almost nothing beyond simple clothing and the tools they used for labor. Yet both groups still lived within a world shaped by strict authority, physical hardship, and uncertainty about the future. By evening, when the sunlight finally softened, relief spread quietly across the land. The Nile glowed gold beneath the lowering sun. Palm trees cast long shadows across the fields. Children returned home slowly with tired steps and dusty skin. The villages filled once more with the smells of cooking. Lentils simmering in clay pots. Fish roasting over open flames. Fresh bread cooling on woven mats. For many children, the evening meal became the most comforting moment of the entire day. Families gathered close together. The work paused briefly. Voices softened. Even exhausted adults sometimes smiled more easily after sunset. Children leaned against parents while listening to conversations drifting through the warm air. Stories returned during these quiet hours. Grandparents remembered old flood seasons. Mothers spoke about relatives in nearby villages. Fathers discussed work along the river or news from distant towns carried by traveling merchants. Children listened carefully to everything. The ancient world was passed from one generation to the next through spoken memory as much as written record. Night eventually settled fully across the Nile Valley once more. Oil lamps flickered inside homes. The stars emerged bright and endless overhead. Far away, jackals cried somewhere near the desert edge. Children curled onto sleeping mats while warm winds moved softly through cracks in the mud brick walls. Some fell asleep quickly from exhaustion. Others lay awake for a little while listening to the sounds of the night. Water against the shore. Quiet voices outside. The distant creaking of boats tied beside the river. And slowly, gently, ancient Egypt drifted back into darkness again while countless children rested their tired bodies before another dawn of labor, heat, dust, and ordinary survival beside the eternal Nile. The Nile moved slowly beneath the last hours of darkness, carrying cool air across the sleeping land. In the quiet before dawn, the riverbanks felt softer than they would later beneath the fierce weight of the sun. Reeds bent gently near the water. Palm leaves whispered in the faint wind. Somewhere along the shore, a small fishing boat rocked quietly against wooden posts while its owner still slept nearby on a woven mat. Across Egypt, children rested in crowded homes of mud brick and straw. Some slept deeply from exhaustion. Others stirred often through the warm night air. Babies breathed softly beside mothers whose hands were still rough from the day's labor. Older children lay shoulder to shoulder beneath thin cloth coverings while insects drifted through narrow openings near the ceilings. And then, slowly, another morning began. The first sounds were always small. A clay bowl being lifted. Ashes stirred inside a cooking fire. Bare feet crossing packed earth floors. The world awakened gently before becoming busy again. For many children, there was almost no difference between one day and the next. The rhythm of life repeated itself endlessly beside the river. Wake before sunrise. Work beneath the heat. Eat simple food. Rest briefly after dark. Sleep. Then begin again. Yet inside that repetition, entire childhoods unfolded quietly. A boy who once struggled to lift water jars gradually grew strong enough to carry two at once. A girl learning to knead bread beside her mother slowly became skilled enough to prepare entire meals alone. The changes happened little by little, almost unnoticed. The ancient world expected children to grow useful long before it allowed them to grow old. In the fields near the Nile, early morning remained the gentlest time of day. Workers hurried to finish difficult tasks before the full heat arrived. Children followed adults through damp soil where the smell of river mud rose softly into the cool air. The farmland beside the Nile looked alive during these hours. Green plants moved in the breeze. Birds searched for insects between rows of crops. Water flowed quietly through irrigation channels cut carefully into the earth. Children sometimes paused briefly to splash cool water onto dusty faces or sore arms before work resumed again. These small moments of relief mattered. Especially during the hottest seasons, when the sun could feel almost endless overhead. Many boys spent entire mornings guiding animals through fields or helping repair farming tools worn down by constant use. Wooden plows cracked. Rope frayed. Baskets split apart beneath heavy loads of grain. Nothing lasted forever in the harsh climate. Everything needed maintenance. Everything demanded labor. Girls often remained closer to the home, though their work was no less exhausting. Inside hot kitchens and crowded courtyards, they prepared grain, cleaned clothing, cared for younger children, and helped manage the endless tasks that filled daily life. Some girls carried infants on their hips while still children themselves. The babies cried in the heat. Sweat rolled down tired faces. Flies gathered around cooking areas and water jars. Still the work continued because there was no choice except continuation. In wealthier homes, servants performed many of these tasks instead. Yet even there, young servant girls and boys often carried the burden of hard labor while noble families rested in shaded rooms cooled by flowing air and pools of water. A servant child might spend hours polishing floors or carrying heavy jars through quiet hallways decorated with painted walls and carved furniture. The rich and poor lived close together in ancient Egypt, yet their lives could feel worlds apart. Children noticed these differences very early. A poor boy delivering goods into a wealthy household might stare silently at fine linen clothing, painted ceilings, sweet fruits piled on trays, or servants pouring cool water into decorative basins. For a moment he could glimpse another kind of life. Then he would return once more to dusty roads and crowded homes beside the river. Still, even wealthy children did not fully escape hardship. Many noble boys faced strict training from an early age. Tutors demanded obedience. Officials expected discipline and proper behavior. Families arranged futures carefully, shaping children toward positions of status, religious service, or government work. Mistakes carried consequences. Honor mattered deeply. The ancient world placed heavy expectations upon nearly everyone. As the morning stretched toward noon, the air over Egypt grew brighter and hotter. The light itself seemed heavy. Dust drifted slowly across roads crowded with donkeys, merchants, laborers, and children carrying baskets balanced against their hips or shoulders. The markets became louder during these hours. Vendors called softly from shaded stalls lined with bread, onions, fish, dates, pottery, cloth, and baskets woven from reeds. The smell of food mixed with sweat, smoke, animal dung, and river mud carried in on sandals from the shore. Children moved constantly through these crowded spaces. Some worked for merchants weighing grain or carrying supplies between stalls. Others simply wandered beside parents while watching the endless movement around them. The marketplace taught children much about the wider world. Travelers arrived from distant regions bringing strange goods, unfamiliar accents, stories from faraway towns, and rumors about politics, temple affairs, or the latest royal projects. Most ordinary children would never travel far from the Nile communities where they were born. Their world remained local and deeply tied to the land surrounding them. Yet through merchants and travelers, pieces of distant places entered their lives briefly before disappearing again down dusty roads or along the river. By midday, exhaustion spread across the villages and cities alike. Workers slowed their movements beneath the crushing heat. Children rested where they could find shade. Some curled beside walls. Others slept near storage jars or beneath carts while adults continued working nearby. The heat created a strange silence during these hours. Even conversations became quieter. The air shimmered above stone streets and rooftops. Dogs lay motionless in narrow strips of shadow. The Nile itself looked calmer beneath the blinding sunlight. Inside homes, mothers sometimes used these quieter moments to care for sick children away from the noise outside. Illness was a constant presence in ancient life. Coughing, fevers, stomach sickness, eye infections caused by dust and insects. Some children recovered quickly. Others weakened slowly over many days. Ancient healers mixed herbs, oils, honey, and crushed minerals into medicines believed to ease pain or drive away sickness. Amulets hung beside sleeping mats. Prayers were whispered to protective gods. Families tried everything they could. But medicine could only do so much. Children learned early that life often balanced between health and danger in ways no one fully controlled. A healthy child might suddenly disappear from a household, leaving behind an empty sleeping mat and grieving parents who still needed to rise before dawn the next morning. Death did not feel distant in ancient Egypt. It lived beside ordinary life constantly. And yet people still loved deeply. This may be one of the quietest truths hidden within the ancient world. Parents continued loving children despite knowing how fragile life could be. They sang softly to babies. They smiled when toddlers learned new words. They carried sleeping children inside from the evening air. Even exhausted fathers returning from brutal labor sometimes lifted sons onto tired shoulders for a few moments while walking home at sunset. These small acts rarely appeared in official histories. Stone monuments recorded victories, taxes, kings, and temple ceremonies. But ordinary tenderness disappeared more easily from history. Still, it existed everywhere. As afternoon faded, the harsh brightness over the Nile Valley slowly softened again. The western sky turned warm with gold and red light. Workers began leaving fields and workshops while the sounds of tools gradually faded into evening quiet. Children returned home dusty, sweaty, and exhausted. Some carried fish from the river. Others balanced bundles of reeds or baskets of grain. Their legs ached. Their hands were roughened by labor. Yet evening brought relief. Cooking fires glowed outside homes. Bread baked in clay ovens. Neighbors spoke softly while sitting near doorways beneath the cooling air. Children often washed dust from their feet beside shared water jars before eating the night meal with family. The food remained simple for most people. Bread, beans, onions, fish when available, dates during good seasons. Sometimes the meal felt plentiful. Sometimes very little remained. Still, families gathered together each night as darkness settled gently across the villages. The stars emerged one by one above the river. Oil lamps flickered against mud brick walls. Children listened sleepily while adults spoke about tomorrow's work, changing floodwaters, repairs needed on tools or roofs, and rumors drifting from larger cities farther along the Nile. The world felt enormous and uncertain beyond the familiar villages. Yet within the small homes beside the river, life continued quietly through routine and endurance. One child drifted asleep against a mother's shoulder. Another stared out the doorway toward the dark water reflecting starlight in the distance. And slowly, beneath the warm ancient night, Egypt grew silent once more while the endless river carried time gently forward. During the coldest months of the year, the mornings beside the Nile carried a different feeling. The air before sunrise felt sharper against the skin. Mist gathered low over the riverbanks, softening the outlines of boats, reeds, and distant palm trees. Children waking in the darkness sometimes pulled thin linen cloths closer around their shoulders before stepping onto cool packed earth floors. Even then, the day still began early. Ancient Egypt rarely allowed long rest, no matter the season. The grinding stones started again before dawn. Back and forth. Back and forth. The sound moved through the quiet villages like rain that never fully stopped. Inside the homes, mothers bent over low work areas while oil lamps flickered softly nearby. Their hands worked almost automatically after years of repetition. Flour dust settled across arms, clothing, and hair while children slowly stirred awake around them. The smell of fresh dough mixed with smoke from rekindled cooking fires. Outside, the eastern horizon brightened little by little. And soon the roads beside the Nile filled once more with people beginning another day of labor. For children born into farming families, the seasons shaped nearly every part of existence. They understood the yearly flooding of the Nile not through books or official records, but through the changing routines of daily life. When the waters rose, the fields disappeared beneath shining flood water. When the river retreated, rich dark soil remained behind. Then came planting. Then harvesting. Then waiting again for the cycle to continue. Children grew up measuring time through the river itself. A boy might remember his age by recalling how many flood seasons had passed since a difficult year of hunger. A girl might remember a family celebration during the season when the water rose especially high against the banks. The Nile became memory as much as geography. And because life depended on the river completely, children learned to respect its moods very early. Some mornings they traveled beside fathers into shallow marshlands where birds filled the sky in great moving clouds. Fishing nets stretched between poles while the smell of wet reeds drifted through the cool air. The marshes could feel peaceful at dawn. Water insects schemed the surface. Small fish flashed beneath the reeds. The mud remained cool beneath bare feet. Yet danger always lingered there too. Snakes moved silently through the plants. Crocodiles rested near hidden river edges. Children were warned constantly to stay alert near the water. Still, many grew comfortable beside it because the Nile surrounded every part of life from birth onward. Young boys learned to swim early. Girls carried water from the river almost daily. Families washed clothing along the banks. Animals drank there. Boats arrived carrying grain, stone, wood, fish, and travelers from distant settlements. The river connected everything. In the larger cities farther north and south along the Nile, childhood often unfolded beneath even greater noise and movement. The streets of ancient Egyptian cities were narrow and crowded. Mud brick homes leaned closely together while upper windows trapped heat and cooking smells inside the winding alleys below. Children ran through these roads barefoot or wearing simple sandals already worn thin from constant use. The city air carried many scents at once. Bread baking in ovens. Fish drying beneath the sun. Smoke rising from workshops. Animal waste warming in the heat. Perfumed oils drifting from wealthy households. And always dust. Dust settling onto skin, clothing, baskets, walls, and sleeping mats. For poor children living in crowded city neighborhoods, privacy barely existed. Entire families often shared only a few small rooms. At night the homes remained hot and difficult to cool, especially during summer months when the air itself seemed trapped between the narrow streets. Some families slept on rooftops whenever possible, hoping for moving air beneath the stars. Children lying awake there could hear the city breathing through the darkness. Voices drifting from distant courtyards. Dogs barking. Music somewhere far away. Donkeys shifting in nearby alleys. And beyond it all, the soft endless movement of the Nile. Many city children worked from very young ages. Some carried messages between merchants. Some swept workshop floors. Others sold bread, vegetables, or small handmade goods in busy market areas. Tiny hands counted coins. Small feet crossed crowded streets endlessly beneath the heat. The ancient world depended heavily upon child labor because every family needed survival more than comfort. Yet even inside difficult lives, children still searched for moments that belonged only to them. A boy tossing stones into the river after finishing work. Girls singing quietly together while carrying baskets through narrow streets. Children laughing during games played beside temple walls at dusk. These moments appeared and disappeared quickly like cool wind before a hot afternoon. But they mattered deeply. Childhood protected itself however it could. Inside temple schools, the atmosphere felt very different from the noisy streets outside. The rooms were quieter, more controlled. The smell of ink, papyrus, and old stone replaced the smells of markets and river mud. Boys training to become scribes sat cross-legged while practicing symbols over and over again beneath the eyes of strict teachers. The Egyptian writing system required years of memorization. Hundreds of signs. Careful brush strokes. Precise copying. Mistakes brought punishment quickly. Ancient writings speak openly about teachers beating students with sticks or canes to enforce discipline. Adults believed hardship prepared boys for responsibility. A child learning to write might spend long hours with aching legs and cramped fingers while trying not to make errors on rough practice surfaces. Yet many families still considered education a great privilege because scribes escaped the brutal physical labor faced by most workers. A scribe worked with words instead of carrying stone beneath the burning sun. Children understood this difference clearly. Knowledge itself could change a life, though only for a small number. For most ordinary children, the future remained tied to physical labor from beginning to end. As midday approached once again, sunlight flooded across the Nile Valley with growing intensity. The cool softness of morning disappeared. Stone walls radiated heat. Roads shimmered. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads while sweat darkened their linen clothing. Children working outdoors often became silent during these hours, saving energy beneath the crushing sun. A young girl grinding grain beside her mother could feel her shoulders burning from effort. A boy herding goats beyond the village might stare longingly toward strips of shade beneath distant palm trees. The heat demanded patience. It slowed movement, thickened the air, filled mouths with dryness and dust. And still the work continued. In wealthy homes, servants moved through shaded courtyards carrying cool water in painted jars. Some rich children spent afternoons listening to music lessons or learning religious stories from tutors while servants fanned the air gently nearby. Yet even privileged childhood remained surrounded by strict expectations. Boys prepared for official duties. Girls prepared for marriage and household leadership. Family honor shaped daily behavior closely. The ancient world valued obedience deeply across every social class. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening, life became gentler once more. Workers returned from fields and workshops while the golden light spread across the river. Boats drifted toward shore carrying fishermen home after long days on the water. Their nets smelled strongly of fish and algae while damp ropes coiled heavily across wooden decks. Children waiting along the shore sometimes ran forward eagerly if the catch looked good. Fish meant food. And good food could change the mood of an entire household. Back inside the villages, cooking fires appeared one by one as darkness approached. The smell of evening meals drifted slowly through the warm air. Lentils, onions, fresh bread, occasionally roasted duck or goat during special celebrations. Families gathered close together after sunset because nighttime offered the only real pause from labor. Children listened quietly while adults talked about taxes, repairs, flooding conditions, or news brought by travelers along the river routes. Some evenings were calm. Others carried tension. A failed harvest in a nearby village. Rumors of increased labor demands from officials. Sickness spreading somewhere farther south. The worries of adults surrounded children constantly, even when nobody spoke directly to them. Still, there were peaceful moments too. A grandmother humming softly beside the doorway. A father repairing a fishing net while his son watched sleepily nearby. a mother brushing dust gently from her daughter's hair before bed. These small acts filled the spaces between hardship. And perhaps because life felt uncertain, they mattered even more. Night eventually settled fully over Egypt again. The stars brightened above the dark river. Palm leaves rustled softly in the cooling breeze. One by one, lamps dimmed inside the homes while exhausted children curled onto sleeping mats beside family members already drifting toward sleep. Tomorrow would arrive soon enough. Another dawn. Another day of heat, labor, dust, and survival beside the endless Nile. There were nights in ancient Egypt when the wind carried the smell of rain from far to the south. The clouds themselves might never reach the villages along the Nile, yet people still lifted their faces slightly toward the cooler air, sensing change somewhere beyond the horizon. Children noticed these small shifts too. The way palm leaves moved differently. The heavier scent rising from the riverbanks. The softer feeling in the air before dawn. Life beside the Nile taught people to observe quietly because survival depended on noticing small things. The height of the river. The color of the water. The condition of crops. The mood of animals before weather changed. Children learned these lessons naturally from the adults around them without formal instruction. A boy helping his father repair fishing nets might hear conversations about flood levels while pretending not to listen. A girl carrying water jars could overhear older women discussing signs of poor harvests or sickness spreading in nearby settlements. Knowledge moved through ordinary life softly and constantly. Nothing felt completely separate. In the early morning darkness, before the villages fully awakened, some children already walked the roads carrying loads that bent their small bodies forward. Bundles of reeds. Clay jars. Baskets of grain. Firewood gathered from scarce patches of brush farther from the river. The roads beneath their feet were uneven and dusty, worn smooth by countless travelers over generations. Sandals slapped quietly against packed earth. Donkeys snorted in the cool air. Somewhere nearby, bread ovens crackled as flames slowly grew brighter beneath clay walls blackened by years of smoke. For poor families especially, every child's labor mattered. Without enough helping hands, daily survival became much harder. A family with many children often depended on older sons and daughters almost as heavily as adults. Children cared for babies while parents worked. They carried supplies, gathered fuel, cleaned tools, prepared food, repaired nets and baskets. Childhood blended so completely with responsibility that many children probably never imagined life any other way. Yet they still remained children in quiet hidden ways. A boy walking toward the fields at sunrise might pause to chase birds lifting suddenly from the reeds. Girls working near the river could still whisper jokes softly while adults were distracted. Children found small openings for play inside even the hardest routines. Sometimes the simplest things brought comfort. Cool mud beneath tired feet. A breeze drifting through a shaded courtyard. Sweet dates shared secretly between friends. The sound of music during festival evenings. The ancient world could be harsh, but it was not entirely without warmth. As sunlight spread slowly across the Nile Valley, workers filled the fields once again. The farmland looked beautiful from a distance during the growing season. Green plants moving gently beneath the breeze. Water channels reflecting the bright sky. Palm trees rising along the edges of villages. But inside the fields themselves, labor remained constant and exhausting. Children bent low beside adults while pulling weeds from the soil or carrying harvested crops beneath the increasing heat. The sun climbed steadily overhead. Birdsong faded. Sweat darkened linen clothing. Dust stuck to damp skin. Sometimes children became so tired that their movements slowed almost to sleepwalking. Yet adults around them were equally exhausted. Entire communities carried fatigue together. There was no separate world reserved for childhood rest. The work belonged to everyone. In the workshops of larger towns, the atmosphere felt different but equally demanding. Stoneworkers shaped blocks beneath showers of pale dust that coated hair, eyelashes, and lungs. Carpenters cut wood inside rooms smelling of sawdust and smoke. Metal workers stood beside blazing furnaces while heat rolled across the walls like waves. Children apprenticed in these places often spent years performing small repetitive tasks before learning skilled work themselves. Sweeping floors, carrying water, sorting tools, turning grinding wheels, watching carefully, always watching. A master craftsman expected obedience and patience. Mistakes could waste valuable materials or damage expensive tools. Punishment came quickly in many workshops. A sharp slap, a shouted insult, a strike from a stick across the shoulders. The ancient world believed discipline created strength. Mercy was not always considered necessary. And so many children grew up carrying fear quietly inside themselves while trying to avoid mistakes during long days of labor. Yet even strict adults sometimes reveal gentleness unexpectedly. A tired craftsman sharing extra bread with an apprentice after a difficult day. A fisherman teaching a young boy how to untangle nets without anger. A mother cooling her daughter's sore hands in river water after hours of grinding grain. Care often appeared in practical forms rather than spoken affection. Life demanded usefulness, but human tenderness still survived within that demanding world. Near the temples, children often watched processions pass through the streets during important religious festivals. Priests dressed in fine linen moved slowly beneath the sunlight while incense smoke drifted upward into the hot air. Musicians played drums, flutes, and rattles while crowds gathered beside decorated statues carried through the city. For ordinary children, these ceremonies must have seemed both beautiful and distant. The temples represented power beyond everyday survival. Massive stone walls towered above the crowded neighborhoods nearby. Inside those walls, priests studied sacred rituals while workers cleaned polished floors and prepared offerings for the gods. Some children dreamed of entering temple service someday. Others simply stared in wonder at painted columns and golden decorations glimpsed briefly through open gates. Religion surrounded every part of Egyptian life. People prayed for healthy children, for good floods, for relief from sickness, for protection during childbirth, for safety on the river. Children absorbed these prayers naturally because uncertainty surrounded them constantly. Even ordinary accidents could become deadly. A cut infected by dirty water. A fever during summer heat. A boat overturned during strong currents. Parents lived with quiet fear much of the time because life could disappear so suddenly. Perhaps this is why family bonds often felt so strong despite the hardships. Mothers held sleeping children close during cool nights. Fathers taught sons skills carefully because knowledge meant survival. Older sisters carried younger brothers patiently through crowded streets. Love existed inside labor rather than apart from it. As afternoon settled heavily across the land, the Nile shimmered beneath white sunlight. The roads emptied slightly during the hottest hours. Even animals sought shade wherever they could find it. Children rested briefly beside walls, under trees, or inside dark rooms where air moved more slowly. Some fell asleep almost immediately from exhaustion. Others sat quietly listening to distant sounds drifting through the heat. Hammering from workshops. Water splashing along the riverbanks. Voices echoing faintly from markets. the endless murmur of human life continuing beneath the sun. Inside homes, women prepared evening meals while younger children played nearby with simple handmade toys. Small dolls of cloth or clay. Wooden animals. Balls woven from reeds. Even in poor households, parents sometimes created these tiny objects because they understood something important quietly and naturally. Children still needed moments of softness. Moments where imagination briefly replaced labor. A little girl rocking a clay doll beside the doorway remained a child, even if tomorrow she would carry heavy water jars again before sunrise. As evening approached, the air slowly cooled. The sunlight turned golden across the river. Workers returned home through dusty roads while birds crossed the sky above the palm trees. Children walked more slowly now, their bodies drained from another long day. Some carried tools over narrow shoulders. Others balanced baskets against aching hips. Many were silent from exhaustion. Yet when they reached home and smelled bread baking or heard familiar voices inside the courtyard, a small feeling of safety sometimes returned. Families gathered close during these evening hours. Oil lamps flickered softly against mud brick walls while meals were shared carefully. Adults spoke about work, taxes, repairs, weather, and river conditions. Children listened sleepily while eating simple food beside the warmth of the fire. Outside, the Nile darkened beneath the stars. The sounds of the villages gradually faded. One by one, homes became quiet. And beneath the endless ancient sky, children drifted toward sleep once more while the river continued carrying time silently through the heart of Egypt. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, a child in ancient Egypt would wake suddenly and hear nothing at all. No grinding stones. No voices from the market. No hammering from distant workshops. Only the soft breathing of family members sleeping nearby and the faint sound of wind moving through cracks in the mud brick walls. Those quiet moments could feel strangely large. The darkness inside the home seemed deep beneath the weak glow of a dying oil lamp. Shadows rested against the walls where baskets, jars, and folded linen cloths waited for morning use. Outside, the Nile flowed unseen through the night, steady and patient as always. A child lying awake might listen carefully to the silence before sleep slowly returned again. Then dawn would come. It always came. The ancient world moved according to rhythms that no one could stop. The river rose and fell. The sun crossed the sky. Children grew older. And labor began again each morning. In farming villages, the earliest workers often stepped outside before the horizon had fully brightened. The air still carried traces of coolness then, though everyone knew the heat would soon return. Young boys followed fathers into the fields carrying wooden tools worn smooth by years of use. Girls remained near the homes at first, tending fires, preparing grain, and helping younger children wash sleep from their eyes with cool water drawn from clay jars. The smells of morning drifted gently through the village. Smoke. Damp river reeds. Fresh bread baking. Animals stirring in nearby pens. The day felt calm during these early hours, almost peaceful. But beneath that calm waited exhaustion already familiar to every family. Children learned quickly how long a single day could feel beneath the Egyptian sun. Even small tasks became difficult after hours of heat. Walking. Lifting. Grinding grain. Carrying water. Everything demanded strength. And because most people owned very little, tools and supplies had to last as long as possible. Children were taught to repair rather than replace. Broken baskets were rewoven carefully. Torn fishing nets were mended knot by knot. Clay jars cracked by heat were patched when possible. Nothing useful was wasted easily. A child watching adults work absorbed these lessons constantly without needing explanation. Life itself depended on careful use of resources, especially among poor families. During seasons when the Nile flooded successfully and crops grew well, villages sometimes felt lighter in mood. Meals became more filling. Grain stores remained steady. Workers smiled more easily in the evenings while sitting beside cooking fires. Children noticed these changes immediately. A full stomach changed everything. Laughter returned more often. Games lasted longer after sunset. Adults spoke with less tension in their voices. But good seasons never erased hardship completely. The labor remained endless. Even during times of plenty, people still worked from dawn until darkness beneath heavy heat and strict social expectations. In larger cities, noble households continued operating according to routines far removed from village life. Servants rose before sunrise to sweep floors, prepare baths, arrange clothing, and organize meals for wealthy families. Young servant children moved silently through shaded hallways carrying trays, water jars, and folded linen. Some had been born into servitude. Others arrived because poverty forced their families to send them away in exchange for food or security. These children often learned to read moods carefully. A harsh voice from a noble official. An impatient gesture from a mistress of the household. A sign that punishment might follow even small mistakes. Fear became part of daily awareness for many working children. Not dramatic fear. Quiet fear. The kind that settles deep inside the body over many years. The fear of dropping something valuable. Of failing at a task. Of being blamed unfairly. Of not working quickly enough. Ancient Egypt valued order and obedience deeply, and children lived beneath that expectation constantly. Yet within wealthy homes there could also be moments of unexpected kindness. A cook slipping sweet fruit to a hungry servant child. An older servant helping a frightened young worker avoid punishment. A noble woman allowing tired children to rest briefly during the hottest part of the afternoon. Human softness survived quietly even within rigid systems. Near the temples, the lives of children preparing for religious service followed their own routines. Temple courtyards smelled of incense, polished stone, and burning oils. Priests moved through cool halls decorated with painted scenes of gods, stars, rivers, and sacred animals. Boys training within temple schools memorized prayers and copied symbols carefully onto writing surfaces while teachers watched closely nearby. The work demanded concentration and patience. Hours passed slowly inside those shaded rooms. Outside, sunlight blazed across the city while inside, brushes scratched softly against papyrus and stone. For some boys, temple education offered stability and purpose. For others, it brought pressure and strict discipline. The ancient world rarely separated learning from hardship. Knowledge had to be earned through endurance. Meanwhile, ordinary children continued living close to the river itself. The Nile shaped not only labor but imagination. Children watched boats arriving from distant regions carrying strange goods and unfamiliar travelers. Sailors told stories about cities farther south or ports near the Great Sea to the north. A child standing beside the riverbank at sunset might stare at those boats with quiet wonder. What existed beyond the familiar villages and fields? Beyond the temples and dusty roads? Most would never travel far enough to know. Their lives remained tied to the same stretches of river where parents and grandparents had lived before them. Yet the boats kept moving. North and south. Day after day. The Nile connected countless lives together across the kingdom. As afternoon heat settled once more across the land, work slowed slightly in the fields and workshops. Children searched for shade instinctively. Some sat beneath palm trees while eating small pieces of bread. Others rested against cool mud brick walls where the sunlight could not reach them directly. During these quiet hours, fatigue often became overwhelming. A child's body could only endure so much. Dust-coated skin. Muscles ached. Eyes burned from bright light and smoke. Yet after only a short rest, labor resumed again. Because there was always more work waiting. Animals needed feeding. Water jars needed filling. Tools needed cleaning. Grain needed grinding for the evening meal. Inside homes, women and girls prepared food slowly while younger children hovered nearby, hungry after long days. The smell of cooking drifted outward into the streets. Onions sizzling over fires. Fresh bread warming inside clay ovens. Fish roasting beside glowing coals. These evening smells must have felt deeply comforting after exhausting days beneath the sun. Families gathered together as darkness approached. Children sat cross-legged beside parents while eating from shared dishes. Conversations moved quietly through the rooms. Talk of taxes. Flood conditions. Repairs needed before the next season. Rumors from nearby towns. Sometimes stories too. Old stories passed through generations. Stories about clever animals. About ancient kings. About the gods guiding the sun across the heavens each day. Children listened with heavy eyes while shadows flickered softly against the walls. Outside, night slowly covered the Nile Valley. The heat loosened at last. Cooler wind drifted through the palm trees. Boats rocked gently against the shore beneath starlight. And one by one, families prepared for sleep again. Sleeping arrangements were simple for most ordinary people. Woven reed mats. Rolled cloth. Occasionally wooden headrests instead of pillows. Entire families shared small rooms where privacy barely existed. Children often fell asleep listening to adult voices still speaking quietly nearby. Sometimes those voices carried worry. Sometimes tenderness. Sometimes simple exhaustion after another long day survived successfully. The stars above Egypt looked endless in the ancient darkness. Without bright city lights, the sky stretched across the world in brilliant detail. Children lying awake briefly before sleep could see entire rivers of stars flowing above the rooftops and palm trees. Perhaps some imagined the gods moving there. Perhaps some simply watched quietly until sleep claimed them. And then, slowly, the villages grew silent once more. Only the Nile continued moving through the darkness, carrying cool night air past sleeping homes where countless children rested their tired bodies before another dawn beside the eternal river. By the time the eastern sky began to pale again, the air inside many homes had already grown warm. Children shifted slowly on their sleeping mats while adults stirred nearby in the darkness. A baby cried softly for a moment before being comforted. Somewhere outside, sandals scraped against the road as the first workers stepped into the cool hours before sunrise. The night never seemed long enough. For most ordinary families beside the Nile, exhaustion stayed close at all times, resting quietly beneath the surface of daily life. Still, morning returned with its familiar routines. A mother knelt beside grinding stones while her arms moved with practiced rhythm. Back and forth. Back and forth. Flour dust rose gently into the dim air. The sound carried through the village alongside the low murmur of voices, the crackle of cooking fires, and the distant calls of fishermen preparing their boats along the riverbank. Children woke into this world slowly. Some rubbed sleep from their eyes before immediately beginning chores. Others sat silently for a few moments, still wrapped in the heavy fog between dreaming and labor. Then the day truly began. In ancient Egypt, childhood often felt tied to movement. Walking to the river. Walking to the fields. Walking through crowded streets carrying supplies or messages. Feet toughened early against dirt roads and hot stone surfaces. Sandals wore thin quickly beneath constant use, and many poorer children went barefoot much of the time. The roads beside the Nile were alive from morning onward. Donkeys loaded with grain baskets. Workers carrying tools across their shoulders. Women balancing water jars carefully against hips or heads. Merchants arranging goods beneath woven awnings for shade. Children moved among all of them like part of the current of life itself. A boy running errands for a baker. A girl carrying flax fibers toward a weaving room. Brothers guiding goats toward grazing areas beyond the village edge. Everywhere there was motion. And everywhere there was work. The Nile Valley depended upon human effort at every level. Water had to be carried. Food prepared. Fields maintained. Stone cut. Boats repaired. Nothing happened without labor. Children understood this long before they fully understood anything else about the world. Some mornings, the riverbanks were crowded with activity before the sun had fully risen. Fishermen pulled wet nets from the water while boys sorted fish into baskets nearby. The smell of river mud mixed with algae, scales, damp rope, and smoke drifting from distant ovens beginning the day's baking. The Nile looked beautiful in those early hours. Soft mist resting above the surface. Birds lifting slowly into the brightening sky. Water turning gold beneath the first sunlight. Children standing there might briefly feel calm before the demands of the day returned. And they always returned. By mid-morning, the heat began spreading steadily across the land. In farming areas, children bent low beside adults while planting crops, cutting grain, or repairing irrigation channels damaged by shifting water and mud. The labor wore down the body slowly over time. Aching backs. Sore hands. Sunburned skin. Yet children rarely expected comfort. They grew up watching adults endure the same hardships without complaint whenever possible. Strength meant survival. Endurance meant survival. The body became both tool and burden. In villages farther from major temples and wealthy estates, life could feel especially uncertain during difficult seasons. Poor harvests or illness quickly threatened entire households. Families measured grain carefully. Bread became thinner. Meals grew smaller. Children noticed hunger immediately because their growing bodies demanded food constantly. A hungry child often became quieter. More tired. Less playful after sunset. Parents carried deep worry during those times, though many tried to hide it behind calm voices and steady routines. A father might work longer hours near the river. A mother might secretly reduce her own portions during meals. Older siblings sometimes pretended they were full so younger children could eat more. These silent sacrifices existed in countless homes across ancient Egypt, though history rarely recorded them. The great stone monuments did not speak about tired mothers skipping meals. But such moments shaped ordinary life far more than royal ceremonies ever could. Inside the larger cities, children encountered another side of Egyptian society entirely. Massive temple walls cast cool shadows across busy roads. Officials traveled through the streets surrounded by servants and guards. Wealthy merchants displayed fine fabrics, jewelry, oils, and carved furniture imported from distant regions. Poor children passing through these areas must have seen enormous contrasts between their own lives and the comfort surrounding the rich. Painted houses with airy courtyards. Pools reflecting sunlight. Servants carrying trays of fresh fruit and cool water. Soft linen untouched by field dust. Yet even wealthy homes carried pressures hidden beneath their beauty. Noble children were expected to behave carefully at all times. Their futures belonged not fully to themselves but to family expectations, political connections, and social duty. A young boy studying to become a scribe or official might spend long hours practicing writing while tutors corrected every mistake sharply. A girl born into an elite household learned rules of behavior, household management, religion, and ceremony from an early age. The ancient world gave children responsibilities long before it gave them freedom. And beneath every level of society stood servants and laborers whose own children worked quietly in support of those larger systems. At midday, Egypt slowed beneath the crushing heat. Even the markets became quieter. Merchants sat beneath shaded coverings while wiping sweat from their faces. Dogs rested in narrow strips of shadow beside walls. Donkeys stood motionless with lowered heads while flies gathered around their eyes. Children searched instinctively for cooler spaces. A shaded courtyard. A riverside breeze. The dark interior of a storage room. Some fell asleep sitting upright from exhaustion before adults shook them awake to continue working. The heat pressed down on everyone equally. Rich. Poor. Free. Servant. Child. Adult. The sun showed little mercy. During quieter afternoon hours, older women sometimes told stories while working together beneath shaded areas near the homes. Children listened nearby while weaving, sorting grain, or repairing baskets. Stories about the gods traveling through the underworld each night. Stories about wise rulers from long ago. Stories about spirits living within the desert beyond the green riverbanks. The desert itself remained mysterious to many children. Most ordinary people stayed close to the fertile land surrounding the Nile because survival depended on it. Beyond that narrow green world stretched vast dry emptiness where hot winds moved over stone and sand beneath endless sky. Children grew up understanding that life existed because of the river. Without the Nile, there would be almost nothing. That truth shaped every part of Egyptian thinking. As evening approached once again, relief spread slowly through the villages. The sunlight softened. Long shadows stretched across the roads. Workers returned home carrying tools coated with dust and mud from another day of labor. Children followed beside them with slow, tired steps. The smells of evening meals soon filled the air. Warm bread. Cooked lentils. Fish roasting over fires. Onions and herbs crushed together into simple stews. For a little while, families gathered closely together inside the glow of firelight and oil lamps. The work paused. Bodies rested. Voices softened. Children leaned against parents or older siblings while listening quietly to conversations drifting through the room. Some evenings carried laughter. Others carried worry. But nearly all carried exhaustion. After the meal, many families stepped outside briefly into the cooler night air. The stars above Egypt shone brilliantly across the dark sky. Palm trees rustled softly in the breeze drifting from the river. Children sat sleepily beside doorways while adults repaired tools, untangled fishing nets, or simply rested in silence after long hours of labor. Night in ancient Egypt often felt gentler than the day. The heat loosened. The noise faded. The world became softer around the edges. And as darkness deepened over the Nile Valley once more, children slowly drifted toward sleep beneath the endless stars while the river continued its quiet journey through the ancient land. Sometimes the wind from the desert arrived during the night carrying fine sand into the villages beside the Nile. By morning, a thin layer of dust rested over sleeping mats, water jars, baskets, and window sills. Children rubbed gritty sand from their eyes while adults quietly cleaned the floors before beginning the day's work again. The desert never felt very far away. Even though the fertile land near the Nile was green and full of life, the dry world beyond it waited constantly at the edges. Children growing up in Egypt understood this without needing anyone to explain it. One step beyond the irrigated fields, the earth hardened. The plants disappeared. The air itself felt emptier. Life survived because the river allowed it. And so each dawn, people returned once more to the tasks that kept that life moving. In the dim early hours before sunrise, village sounds rose slowly from the darkness. A goat bleating softly. A clay jar lowered carefully onto the floor. The crackling of fresh firewood catching flame. Then the grinding stones began. Back and forth. Back and forth. The rhythm seemed endless across the Nile Valley. For many girls, those sounds shaped childhood as deeply as anything else. Long before adulthood, they learned the routines of preparing grain, kneading dough, carrying water, and tending cooking fires. Their hands became skilled through repetition. Their bodies adapted to work that never fully ended. Some mornings, younger children sat nearby still wrapped in sleepiness while older sisters worked beside their mothers. The firelight flickered gently against the walls, casting moving shadows over baskets of grain and stacks of clay bowls waiting for the day ahead. Outside, the sky slowly brightened. The Nile reflected pale silver light between the reeds. And once again, workers began walking toward the fields. Children often traveled quietly during these early hours. Too tired to speak much. Too accustomed to the routine to question it. The dirt paths beneath their feet were cool at first. The air smelled faintly of wet earth drifting from the riverbanks. Palm trees moved gently in the morning breeze while birds crossed the brightening sky overhead. For a short time before the full heat arrived, the world felt almost peaceful. Then the sun climbed higher. And the labor deepened again. In the fields, boys helped guide wooden plows pulled by oxen through rich dark soil left behind after the Nile floods. Mud splashed against their legs while insects hovered near the irrigation channels. The work demanded patience more than speed. Rows had to remain straight. Water had to move properly through the fields. Animals needed steady control. Children learned by watching adults closely and repeating movements over and over again until they became natural. Mistakes were corrected quickly. Sometimes harshly. The ancient world believed children became capable through discipline and endurance. Softness was not always encouraged. Yet there were moments when adults revealed quiet pride in the growth of their children. A father noticing his son lifting heavier tools than before. A mother smiling faintly when bread dough was prepared correctly without help. These small moments of approval mattered deeply because praise itself was often rare. Most ordinary families lived close to exhaustion. Work left little energy for long displays of affection. Still, care existed constantly beneath the surface. It appeared through actions more than words. A parent waking before dawn to prepare food for hungry children. An older brother carrying extra weight so his younger sibling could rest briefly. A grandmother cooling fevered skin with damp cloth beside a sleeping mat. The ancient world could be severe, but people still loved one another quietly within it. By mid-morning, the roads beside the Nile filled with movement and noise. Merchants opened market stalls covered by woven mats that offered small patches of shade. Potters arranged fresh clay vessels in careful rows. Bakers carried warm loaves through crowded streets while flies gathered around baskets of fruit and fish. Children passed through these markets constantly. Some sold goods directly. Others delivered messages or supplies between workshops. Poor boys sometimes carried heavy loads for merchants in exchange for a little food or a few small coins. The markets exposed children to many parts of Egyptian society at once. Farmers smelling of mud and sweat. Priests in clean white linen. Servants hurrying beneath the weight of baskets. Scribes moving carefully through the crowds while protecting rolls of papyrus from dust and damage. Children observed social differences early because they were visible everywhere. A wealthy child traveled shaded by servants. A poor child carried the servants' supplies. Yet all of them lived beneath the same burning sun. In the workshops, the day grew hotter and louder as hours passed. Stoneworkers hammered blocks beneath clouds of pale dust. Metal workers stood beside roaring furnaces while sparks flashed through the dim rooms. Textile workers spun flax fibers endlessly while sweat rolled down their necks beneath the trapped heat. Apprentice children performed much of the lowest labor. Cleaning floors. Fetching water. Sorting materials. Turning heavy grinding tools. The work could feel endless. Some children likely dreamed of escape without even knowing what escape might mean. Yet most accepted their future because every adult around them lived similarly. Hardship did not seem unusual. It simply seemed like life. Near the temples, festivals occasionally interrupted the ordinary rhythm of labor. During these celebrations, streets filled with music, incense, flowers, and crowds gathering to watch sacred processions. Children stood beside adults while priests carried statues of the gods beneath decorated coverings. The smell of incense drifted heavily through the warm air. Drums echoed against temple walls. For a little while, ordinary routines softened. Families ate special foods if they could afford them. Children stayed awake later after sunset. Laughter returned more easily to the streets. These festivals gave people moments of relief from endless work and worry. Even poor children might receive small treats during celebrations. A piece of honey cake. Fresh fruit. Colored beads. Tiny moments of joy could shine brightly inside difficult lives. But when the festivals ended, ordinary labor returned quickly. The Nile still needed tending. The fields still needed work. The taxes still had to be paid. As afternoon heat settled heavily over Egypt again, exhaustion spread through every part of the villages and cities. Children working outdoors narrowed their eyes against the brightness. Their skin burned beneath sunlight reflected from stone, sand, and water. Some paused briefly beside irrigation channels to splash cool water onto their faces. Others rested in tiny strips of shade beside walls before adults called them back to work. The body learned endurance slowly over years. Children who survived into adulthood often carried signs of labor already carved into their muscles, hands, backs, and joints long before old age arrived. Life beside the Nile was beautiful in many ways. But it was never easy. As sunset approached, the light across the river softened into deep gold. Boats drifted homeward carrying fish, reeds, stone, grain, and travelers returning from distant villages. Children waiting near the shore watched the boats carefully, especially if family members worked upon the river. The Nile at evening could feel almost magical. Water glowing beneath the sky. Birds crossing silently overhead. Palm trees darkening against the fading light. For a few moments, the world seemed calm enough to rest. Cooking fires soon brightened the villages again. The smell of evening meals drifted through the warm air. Bread. Fish. Beans. Stew simmering slowly inside clay pots. Families gathered close together after another long day beneath the sun. Children leaned sleepily against parents while listening to quiet conversations around the firelight. Outside, darkness slowly covered the Nile Valley. The stars returned overhead. And one by one, the homes beside the river grew silent while exhausted children closed their eyes beneath the ancient night once more. Long before the first birds began calling from the reeds beside the Nile, some children in ancient Egypt were already awake. The air inside the homes felt thick and warm from the night. Oil lamps burned low beside sleeping mats while faint moonlight slipped through narrow openings in the mud brick walls. Somewhere nearby, a baby stirred softly in sleep. An older woman coughed into the darkness. Then slowly, carefully, the first movements of morning began again. A mother reached for a clay jar. A father sat up with tired shoulders and rubbed dust from his eyes. A child wrapped thin cloth around small bare feet before stepping onto the cool floor. The day ahead waited silently outside. For many families, mornings carried a strange quiet sadness hidden beneath routine. People woke already tired. Their bodies had not fully recovered from the previous day before another one demanded labor once more. Children felt this too. Their limbs ached from carrying water or standing long hours in the fields. Small cuts on hands and feet stung again as work resumed. Yet there was rarely time to stop and think about discomfort. The ancient world moved forward no matter how exhausted people became. And so the grinding stones began once again. Back and forth. Back and forth. That sound drifted across Egypt every morning for countless generations. Girls knelt beside mothers while flour dust settled onto their arms and clothing. Sometimes younger children still half asleep leaned quietly against nearby walls while waiting for bread to finish baking. The smell of warm grain slowly filled the homes. Outside, darkness softened into pale blue light. The Nile reflected the changing sky like polished stone. The coolness before sunrise never lasted long enough. Soon workers were already moving through the roads beside the river. Children walked beside them carrying baskets, tools, bundles of reeds, or empty jars waiting to be filled with water. Donkeys shifted heavily beneath loaded sacks while merchants prepared for another long day in the markets. The roads themselves held the memory of countless footsteps. Packed dirt hardened beneath years of use. Dust rising beneath sandals. Wheel tracks pressed deep into dry earth. Children crossed those roads so often that they likely stopped noticing them at all. They became part of the rhythm of life. In farming villages, the fields stretched outward in dark green strips fed by irrigation channels branching from the Nile. During growing seasons, the crops moved gently beneath the morning breeze while birds gathered near the water searching for insects and grain. Children entered these fields very young. Some worked beside parents almost as soon as they could walk steadily enough across uneven soil. At first they performed small tasks. Gathering dropped grain. Scaring birds away. Carrying water. Watching younger siblings nearby. But as they grew older, the labor increased quickly. A boy who once carried only tools soon learned to guide oxen through muddy fields. A girl who once watched bread baking eventually prepared entire meals herself while caring for younger children at the same time. Responsibility arrived gradually but early. The ancient world did not wait long before asking children to become useful. And usefulness meant survival. During flood season, life near the river changed completely. The Nile rose slowly across the land, swallowing pathways and fields beneath dark moving water. Boats traveled through places where people had walked only weeks earlier. Children watched the flood waters carefully. Some feared them. Others loved the temporary change they brought to familiar villages. The river smelled different during flood season. Richer. Heavier. The scent of wet earth and river plants filled the air while insects gathered near the water's edge. Families worked constantly during these months to protect supplies, animals, and homes from damage. Children carried baskets to higher ground, helped tie boats securely, and moved through flooded areas beside adults balancing carefully across slippery paths. The flooding brought life to Egypt, but it also brought uncertainty. Too much water could destroy homes and crops. Too little could bring hunger later. Children learned early that survival depended on forces much larger than themselves. The river decided much of life. In the cities, meanwhile, another kind of labor filled the days. Temple workers scrubbed polished floors before sunrise while servant children carried water through cool stone halls echoing with footsteps. Bakers prepared bread for crowded neighborhoods where thousands of people depended on daily deliveries of grain and food. The cities smelled different from the villages. More crowded. More crowded in every possible way. More smoke. More sweat. More animals. More noise. The narrow streets trapped heat between the buildings while voices echoed through winding alleys lined with workshops, market stalls, and crowded homes. Children living there grew accustomed to constant movement around them. A boy might fall asleep hearing metal workers hammering long after sunset. A girl carrying bread through the streets would pass priests, merchants, laborers, beggars, officials, and travelers all within a few moments. The world felt larger in the cities, but also harsher, especially for poor children with little protection. Some children had no stable homes at all. Orphaned by illness or famine, they survived through labor wherever work could be found. They swept market stalls, carried loads for merchants, or begged quietly near crowded roads. Ancient Egypt celebrated order and stability in its temples and royal monuments, yet ordinary life could still become deeply fragile for those without family support. Children without strong family ties faced enormous hardship. Family meant safety whenever safety could be found at all. Inside ordinary homes, evenings remained the closest thing many children experienced to peace. After long hours beneath the heat, families gathered together near cooking fires while darkness slowly settled over the Nile Valley. The smell of evening meals drifted through the villages. Warm bread cooling on woven mats. Fish roasting slowly over coals. Stews bubbling inside clay pots blackened by years of use. Children often ate quietly from exhaustion. Some leaned sleepily against parents while chewing slowly beneath flickering lamplight. Adults spoke softly nearby about work waiting tomorrow. Repairs needed on irrigation channels. Rumors from neighboring towns. Taxes demanded by officials. The conversations of ancient adults rarely wandered far from survival because survival itself required constant attention. Still, there were softer moments hidden within those evenings too. A grandfather telling stories beside the doorway while children listened with heavy eyes. A mother humming quietly while mending torn linen. Brothers sharing jokes beneath the stars after finishing chores. The warmth of family closeness after dark. These things mattered because life outside the home often demanded so much strength. Children carried the memory of those quiet evenings into sleep. Night along the Nile could feel deeply still after the noise of daytime faded away. The markets emptied. The workshops darkened. The roads became silent except for distant footsteps or the occasional bark of a dog somewhere beyond the houses. Above everything stretched the enormous Egyptian sky filled with stars. Without lamps brightening the night, the heavens appeared endless and alive. Children lying awake on rooftops or beside open doorways sometimes watched the stars while listening to the soft movement of wind through palm leaves. The priests taught that the gods traveled across the heavens each night. That the sun itself journeyed through darkness before returning again at dawn. Perhaps children imagined those journeys while staring upward. Or perhaps they simply enjoyed the rare coolness of night air against tired skin. Sleep arrived slowly inside the warm homes. One by one, voices faded. Oil lamps dimmed. Families settled onto sleeping mats beside walls, still holding the heat of the day. Outside, the Nile continued moving north through the darkness, calm and eternal beside a world where children grew quickly beneath labor, love, hunger, fear, and the endless rhythm of survival. There were mornings when the sky above the Nile turned pale with light so slowly that it seemed the world itself did not wish to wake. The river remained dark blue beneath the fading stars. Thin mist hovered above the reeds along the shore while the villages rested in those final quiet moments before labor began again. Inside the homes, children slept close beside parents, brothers, sisters, and grandparents. The room smelled faintly of smoke from cooking fires that had burned late into the evening. Dust rested along the floors and woven mats. Clay jars lined the walls beside baskets of grain carefully protected from insects and dampness. For a few brief moments, everything was still. Then someone rose. A mother reached for the grinding stones. A father stepped outside to judge the weather and the river. A child rubbed tired eyes and slowly sat upright in the darkness. Another day beside the Nile had begun. Ancient Egypt often appears in memory as a land of temples, kings, and great monuments rising from the desert. But most children never lived near royal beauty or power. Their world was smaller. A cooking fire. A fishing net. A dusty road. A narrow field beside the river. The rough texture of mud brick beneath small fingertips. These ordinary things shaped childhood far more deeply than the distant lives of rulers. Most children spent little time thinking about greatness. They thought about food. About work. About avoiding punishment. About whether the day would feel unbearably hot. About whether there might be enough bread left after sunset. And still, quietly, they also thought about play, friendship, stories, music, and the small joys hidden within difficult days. Children always find ways to remain children for at least a little while. As dawn spread gently across the villages, the sounds of work slowly filled the air once more. Grinding stones moving steadily. Donkeys braying. Water splashing into clay jars. Voices calling softly across narrow roads. The smells of morning drifted outward through the cool air. Fresh bread baking. Wet river mud. Smoke from newly lit fires. Animals stirring in their pens. Children moved through these familiar routines almost automatically. Some girls knelt beside mothers shaping dough while younger siblings still slept nearby. Boys carried tools toward the fields or followed fishermen down to the riverbanks where boats rocked gently in the pale morning light. The Nile at sunrise often looked calm enough to erase the hardships surrounding it. Golden light spread slowly across the water. Birds crossed low over the reeds. The river carried reflections of palm trees and distant boats through soft rippling movement. For a moment, the world seemed peaceful. But the labor waiting ahead remained heavy. In the fields, children learned patience through repetition. Planting seeds carefully into dark soil. Pulling weeds beneath the growing heat. Carrying harvested grain in rough baskets against tired hips and shoulders. The work moved according to the seasons, yet it never truly stopped. Even during quieter months, tools needed repair. Animals needed care. Food needed preparation. The body remained busy from morning until night. Children who survived the difficult early years of life often became strong through necessity. Their muscles hardened young. Their hands grew rough from work. Many could carry surprising weight long before adulthood. But strength came with a cost. The body also tired young. Ancient skeletons discovered near the Nile often show signs of strain and injury from labor beginning early in life. Bent backs. Worn joints. Damage to bones caused by repetitive work. The ancient world asked much from the human body, especially from poor children. And yet within that harshness, ordinary life still carried moments of beauty difficult to erase. A cool breeze arriving unexpectedly during a hot afternoon. Laughter echoing across irrigation channels while children splashed water onto one another after work. Music drifting through a village during festival nights. The smell of fresh bread after a hungry day. Even small comforts could feel deeply meaningful when life remained uncertain. As the morning continued, the roads beside the Nile became crowded with movement. Merchants balanced goods across donkey backs while traveling toward market areas already filling with noise and dust. Potters displayed jars and bowls outside workshops coated with clay powder. Fishermen carried woven baskets still dripping from the river. Children passed through these spaces constantly. Some worked openly beside adults. Others simply observed while running errands or delivering supplies. A child standing quietly in a marketplace could see nearly every layer of Egyptian society moving around them. Poor laborers with dust-covered skin. Servants hurrying behind wealthy officials. Priests dressed in clean linen. Scribes carrying writing tools carefully protected from dirt and damage. The differences between wealth and poverty were impossible to ignore. Some children ate well every day beneath shaded courtyards cooled by pools of water. Others survived on little more than coarse bread and weak beer while sleeping in crowded rooms beside hungry siblings. Still, the sun rose over everyone equally. The heat arrived for everyone. The Nile carried all their reflections together. By midday, the brightness across Egypt became intense. White temple walls reflected sunlight almost painfully into the eyes. Dust swirled through roads heated by endless footsteps. Workers wrapped cloth tightly around their heads while searching for moments of shade wherever they could find them. Children often became quieter during these hours. The heat drained energy from conversation itself. A girl weaving flax fibers beside her mother might lower her head with exhaustion while fingers continued moving automatically through the work. A boy guarding animals beyond the fields could stare silently toward the river, longing for cool water against burning skin. Many children learned to continue working even when deeply tired. Complaints changed little. The labor still waited. In wealthy households, servant children moved through shaded rooms carrying cool water, folded linens, trays of fruit, and jars of scented oil. Their feet crossed smooth floors while outside, laborers sweated beneath the blazing sun. Some noble children lived protected from the hardest physical labor, yet even they grew up beneath strict control. Tutors demanded discipline. Families arranged futures carefully. Social expectations shaped every action. Freedom belonged to very few people in the ancient world. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening, relief spread gently through the Nile Valley once again. Workers returned from the fields carrying tools over weary shoulders. Boats drifted homeward across glowing water while birds gathered near the reeds. The smell of evening cooking fires began rising through the villages. Children walked home dusty and exhausted, their bodies aching from another long day beneath the sun. Yet evening also brought comfort. Families gathered close together beside firelight. Meals were shared carefully. Stories returned. An older relative might speak softly about flood seasons from many years earlier or describe distant towns visited long ago beside the river routes. Children listened with heavy eyes while shadows flickered against the walls. Outside, the stars slowly appeared overhead. The air cooled slightly. Palm leaves rustled gently in the night wind. For a little while after the evening meal, some children escaped work completely. They sat quietly beside friends near the riverbanks. They watched torchlight reflecting across the water. They listened to music drifting faintly from somewhere deeper inside the village. Those moments passed quickly, but perhaps they remained in memory longer than the labor itself. Because even in an age without much mercy, children still searched instinctively for softness wherever it could be found. And then night deepened once more across ancient Egypt. Oil lamps dimmed. Voices faded. Families settled onto sleeping mats inside warm mud brick homes while the Nile flowed endlessly through the darkness beside them. Tomorrow's labor already waited beyond the horizon. But for now, beneath the ancient stars, the children of the river slept. Before sunrise, the Nile often looked almost black beneath the fading night sky. The water moved slowly and silently beside the sleeping villages. Reeds along the shore bent gently in the cool wind while fishing boats drifted softly against their ropes. Far above, the stars still lingered over the desert beyond the green riverbanks. Inside the homes, children remained wrapped in shallow sleep. Some dreamed peacefully for a little while longer. Others stirred often through the warm night, turning across woven mats beside brothers, sisters, and tired parents already half awake beneath the darkness. The homes themselves held the smell of long daily life. Smoke trapped inside mud brick walls. Dust gathered beneath baskets and clay jars. Linen cloth warmed by many bodies sleeping close together. The scent of grain waiting for morning bread. Then, slowly, the familiar sounds returned again. A cough from somewhere outside. Footsteps crossing packed earth. The soft scrape of stone against stone as grain grinding began before dawn. Another day had arrived. For children in ancient Egypt, life moved with remarkable sameness from one morning to the next. Yet inside that sameness, entire lives quietly unfolded. A little boy too weak to carry water one season became strong enough to guide oxen through muddy fields a few years later. A girl learning to shape bread beside her mother eventually taught younger sisters those same movements. Time flowed gently beside the Nile, shaping children through repetition more than sudden change. The ancient world trained the body through routine. Every task repeated endlessly until it became natural. Carrying, lifting, walking, grinding, washing, weaving, planting, harvesting. Children did not slowly prepare for adult life. They entered it piece by piece almost immediately after early childhood. As the eastern horizon brightened with pale gold light, the villages awakened fully. Doors opened. Cooking fires crackled stronger. Donkeys brayed from narrow courtyards. The smell of fresh bread drifted into the cool morning air while workers gathered tools and supplies for the long hours ahead. Many children ate quickly before work. Simple bread. Perhaps dates. Sometimes onions or leftover fish from the previous evening. Meals were often small, especially among poor families where grain needed careful rationing through difficult seasons. Hunger lived close beside many children. Not always sharp hunger. Sometimes simply a constant emptiness beneath the ribs that never completely disappeared. Yet the body learned to continue working anyway. That quiet endurance shaped ancient life deeply. Outside the villages, the fields stretched toward the river in dark fertile strips. During planting seasons, workers moved steadily through soft earth still damp from irrigation water. Children worked beside adults beneath the rising sun. A boy carrying seed baskets carefully between rows. Girls gathering bundles of flax for weaving. Older children balancing jars of water against aching shoulders while walking narrow paths between the crops. The Nile gave life to the land, but only endless labor transformed that life into survival. Nothing grew easily without human effort. The irrigation canals required constant maintenance. Mud collapsed into them. Weeds blocked the flow of water. Floods damaged their edges year after year. Children spent countless hours helping repair these channels beneath heavy heat and swarming insects. Mud clung to their legs. Mosquitoes hovered around their faces. Sweat mixed with river water and dirt until the body felt coated in the Nile itself. And still the work continued. In fishing villages, life followed the rhythms of the river even more closely. Before dawn, boys often followed fathers onto small wooden boats pushing silently through mist rising from the water. Nets smelled strongly of algae, wet rope, and fish scales. Oars creaked softly while the shoreline slowly brightened behind them. The river could feel peaceful during these hours. Birds schemed low across the surface. Cool air moved against tired faces. The sounds of the waking villages faded behind the reeds. Yet fishing remained dangerous work. Storms could rise suddenly. Boats overturned. Crocodiles waded silently near muddy banks. Children learned caution early because the Nile offered both life and death together. Some boys became excellent swimmers long before adulthood simply because the river surrounded every part of existence. In the cities farther north, childhood unfolded differently but no less harshly. Crowded streets trapped heat between tall mud brick buildings while markets filled with noise from sunrise onward. The smell of sweat, animals, baking bread, smoke, and refuse lingered constantly in the warm air. Children moved through the city like small currents inside a much larger river of people. Some worked inside workshops where the sound of hammering never fully stopped. Others carried goods through market roads so crowded that shoulders brushed strangers at every step. Poor children learned quickly how to avoid trouble in busy places. Which merchants shouted often? Which officials demanded obedience? Which corners of the city felt unsafe after dark? Life in the cities required alertness. Especially for children without protection. Some boys survived through temporary labor alone, sleeping wherever space could be found near markets, temple walls, or crowded courtyards. Illness spread easily in these crowded areas. Dirty water. Rotting food. Flies gathering around waste. The body weakened quickly under such conditions. Many children did not survive long illnesses. Fever could arrive suddenly during hot months and carry someone away within days. A simple infection from a cut or blister sometimes became deadly without warning. Parents understood this fragility deeply. Mothers watched sick children through entire nights while whispering prayers to protective gods. Fathers searched desperately for healers, herbs, or medicine whenever illness entered the household. Ancient medicine combined practical remedies with spiritual belief because people saw little separation between body and spirit. Honey covered wounds. Herbs eased pain. Amulets guarded against unseen dangers. Children wore protective charms around necks or wrists while parents hoped the gods would show mercy. Sometimes children recovered. Sometimes they did not. And life beside the Nile continued moving forward either way. This may have made love feel especially precious in the ancient world. Because nothing felt guaranteed. Parents held sleeping children closely after sickness passed. Older siblings watched younger brothers and sisters carefully near deep water or crowded roads. Family bonds carried enormous importance because survival itself often depended upon them. As midday approached again, sunlight flooded the Nile Valley with harsh white brightness. The coolness of dawn disappeared completely. Stone walls radiated heat. The roads shimmered beneath moving dust. Children working outdoors narrowed their eyes against the burning light while sweat-soaked linen clothing already stiff from repeated use. During the hottest hours, conversation faded. People saved energy. Even the animals grew quiet beneath the crushing afternoon sun. A child sitting briefly in the shade beside a mud brick wall might close tired eyes for only a moment before being called back to work again. Rest remained brief for most people. The labor always returned. Yet evening eventually returned too. And with evening came relief. The western sky turned gold above the river while boats drifted slowly homeward across glowing water. Workers left the fields carrying tools coated with dirt and mud. Children walked beside them with exhausted steps. Some carried bundles of reeds. Others balanced baskets against sore hips. Many simply stared quietly toward the village smoke rising ahead, already thinking about food and sleep. Cooking fires soon brightened the twilight. The smell of bread, lentils, onions, and fish spread through the warm evening air while families gathered close together once more. Children listened sleepily to adult voices around the firelight. Talk of taxes, flood levels, neighbors, repairs needed before the next season, and sometimes stories. Always stories. Stories about the gods traveling through the stars. About ancient kings remembered long after death. About strange animals living beyond the desert. The stories drifted softly through the darkness while the Nile moved endlessly nearby. Then slowly, one by one, lamps dimmed inside the homes. The villages quieted. The stars brightened overhead. And the children of ancient Egypt closed their tired eyes once more beside the eternal river. In the deepest hours before dawn, when even the dogs in the villages had grown quiet, the Nile continued flowing through the darkness without pause. The river did not sleep. It carried cool air along its surface while reeds whispered softly at the water's edge. Small waves touched the muddy banks with gentle rhythm beneath a sky crowded with stars. Inside the homes beside the river, children slept closely together on woven mats spread across hard floors still holding warmth from the previous day. Some curled against parents or older siblings. Others slept alone near walls lined with baskets, jars, and folded linen cloth. The rooms were simple. Mud brick walls. Wooden stools. Clay lamps. The smell of smoke trapped in the ceiling from many evenings of cooking fires. Yet for most children, these small spaces contained the entire center of life. Home meant safety whenever safety could be found at all. And before long, morning returned again. The first sounds came quietly. A mother moving through darkness while trying not to wake younger children. The soft crack of dry reeds placed into a cooking fire. A distant cough outside somewhere beyond the walls. Then slowly the villages awakened. Grinding stones began their endless rhythm. Back and forth. Back and forth. That sound traveled through ancient Egypt every morning like the beating of a slow steady heart. Girls learned the movement young. Their arms ached at first beneath the weight of the heavy stones, but over time the body adapted. Muscles strengthened. Hands roughened. The work became automatic through repetition. Children in ancient Egypt rarely experienced long periods of idleness. Even small moments were usually filled with chores waiting nearby. Water jars needed refilling. Animals needed feeding. Flax needed spinning. Tools needed cleaning. The ancient household itself functioned almost like a living machine powered by constant human labor. And children formed part of that machine from very early ages. As dawn brightened over the Nile Valley, workers stepped onto the roads once more. The air still carried traces of coolness before the heat arrived. Palm trees moved gently against the pale sky while birds crossed above the river searching for food among the reeds. Some children walked quietly beside fathers toward the fields carrying wooden tools worn smooth by years of use. Others remained near the homes beside mothers preparing bread and caring for younger siblings. A little girl balancing a clay jar against her hip might pause briefly near the riverbank to watch sunlight spreading across the water before continuing her work. Such moments passed quickly. But perhaps they stayed in memory. Because even tired children noticed beauty when it appeared softly enough. The Nile at sunrise often seemed peaceful beyond words. Mist lifting slowly above the water. Boats drifting silently through golden light. The smell of wet earth rising from the shore. For a little while, before the full noise and heat of day arrived, the world felt calm. Then labor began fully again. In farming communities, children spent long hours beneath open sky where the sun ruled every movement. During planting seasons, they scattered seed into rich dark soil while adults guided plows pulled by oxen nearby. The earth beneath their feet felt soft and cool in the early morning. By midday it would burn beneath the sunlight. Children learned to judge time not by clocks but by the changing heat, the position of shadows, and the movements of workers around them. Morning brought energy. Midday brought exhaustion. Evening brought relief. Then darkness brought sleep. And after sleep, everything began again. During harvest seasons, entire families worked together gathering grain before it spoiled or scattered. Children carried heavy bundles nearly as large as themselves while dust from dry stalks filled the air around them. The work covered skin and hair with pale chaff. Hands blistered. Shoulders burned beneath rough baskets. Still, there could also be moments of shared closeness during harvest. Families worked side by side. Neighbors helped one another. Voices drifted softly across the fields while the Nile shimmered nearby beneath the sunlight. In difficult lives, companionship itself became a form of comfort. Farther along the river, stone quarries and construction sites demanded another kind of labor. Older boys sometimes worked carrying tools, water, or supplies for crews shaping limestone beneath brutal heat. The sound of hammering echoed across the stone surfaces while pale dust settled into every fold of clothing and skin. Massive building projects rose slowly through years of human effort. Temples, walls, tombs, monuments that would survive for thousands of years. Yet the children helping support such work often remained invisible to history. No inscriptions recorded their names. No statues preserved their faces. Still they were there, sweating beneath the same sun, breathing stone dust into young lungs, returning home exhausted after long days beside men whose bodies were already worn down by labor. In the cities, meanwhile, childhood moved through crowded streets filled with constant noise and movement. Marketplaces overflowed with merchants shouting prices while animals pushed through narrow roads lined with stalls selling bread, fish, cloth, pottery, and oils. Children worked everywhere within this crowded world. A boy carrying messages through twisting alleys. Girls helping spin flax fibers inside dark weaving rooms. Young servants moving silently through wealthy homes where cool courtyards and painted walls seemed far removed from the dusty streets outside. Children noticed social differences immediately because they shaped daily life so clearly. One child slept beside servants on hard floors after eating coarse bread. Another rested beneath fine linen inside shaded rooms while tutors taught writing and mathematics nearby. Yet even wealthy childhood carried limits. Discipline remained strict across every level of society. Obedience mattered deeply. The ancient world believed children must learn their place early. Punishments came quickly for disobedience or laziness. A sharp voice. A strike from a cane. Public embarrassment before others. Fear became part of growing up for many children. Not constant terror, but a quiet awareness that mistakes could bring pain or shame very suddenly. And yet kindness survived too. A teacher praising careful writing. A mother saving the softest piece of bread for a hungry child. An older brother lifting a sleeping sibling onto tired shoulders after a long walk home. These small acts mattered deeply because life often felt hard around them. As afternoon heat settled heavily over the Nile Valley once more, workers slowed their movements beneath the blazing sun. Children searched instinctively for shade near walls, palm trees, or irrigation channels carrying cool river water through the fields. The smell of mud and wet plants drifted upward from the canals while insects hummed lazily in the thick air. Some children splashed water onto dusty arms and faces before returning reluctantly to work. Others rested only long enough to catch their breath. The labor never fully paused. Inside homes during these hot hours, women prepared evening meals while younger children played quietly nearby with simple toys carved from wood or shaped from clay. Tiny dolls. Small animal figures. Balls woven from reeds. Even in poor households, parents sometimes found ways to create these little objects because they understood childhood still needed softness wherever possible. A child laughing quietly over a handmade toy remains something precious in a difficult world. As sunset finally approached, relief spread slowly across Egypt again. The sunlight softened into gold over the river. Birds crossed toward the marshes. Workers returned home through dusty roads with weary steps. Children walked beside them carrying tools, baskets, or nothing at all beyond their exhaustion. Then came evening. The gentlest part of the day. Cooking fires glowed warmly outside the homes. The smell of bread and lentils drifted through cooling air. Families gathered close beneath the first stars appearing overhead. Children listened sleepily while adults spoke in low tired voices about tomorrow's work, the condition of the river, repairs needed on roofs or boats, and rumors traveling along the Nile from distant towns. The firelight flickered softly against mud brick walls. Night deepened. Voices faded one by one. And beside the eternal river flowing silently through the darkness, the children of ancient Egypt drifted slowly back into sleep. Now the night beside the Nile has grown very still. The cooking fires have faded into soft red embers. The markets are quiet. The workshops have fallen silent at last. Even the donkeys and dogs resting near the village roads no longer stir beneath the warm darkness. Above the river, the stars shine gently over ancient Egypt. The Nile continues its endless journey northward, moving slowly through reeds and sleeping villages just as it did thousands of years ago. Cool air drifts across the water and slips softly between the mud brick homes where tired families rest after long days of labor beneath the sun. Inside those homes, the children of the ancient world sleep quietly now. Their small hands finally still after carrying water jars, gathering grain, weaving flax, tending fires, repairing nets, and walking dusty roads beside the riverbanks. Tomorrow, the sun will rise again over the fields and temples. The grinding stones will begin once more. Boats will drift across golden water. Bread will bake inside clay ovens. Voices will return to the crowded streets. And life beside the Nile will continue as it always has, steady as the river itself. But for now, everything has become calm. The heat of the day has faded into the coolness of night. Palm leaves rustle softly in the dark. A distant boat creaks gently against its rope near the shore. The stars reflect faintly across the quiet water. And somewhere inside the sleeping villages of ancient Egypt, children dream beneath linen cloths while the ancient world rests around them. So let the river carry your thoughts away now. Let the dust of the roads settle. Let the noise of the markets disappear into silence. Feel the warmth of the ancient night growing softer and softer. The Nile keeps flowing through the darkness. The stars remain above the desert. And slowly, Gently, the old world drifts into sleep,